There are moments in war when the entire future seems to balance on one small, distant place that hardly anyone back home could find on a map. In the spring of 1944, that place was Saipan, and the young men crossing the ocean toward it carried more than rifles and packs. They carried the quiet, unshakable hope that this single island might finally bring the long war close enough to Japan's heart to end it before their own younger brothers had to come and finish what they started. Consider a young Marine from a small town in the American heartland. He had grown up working the fields with his father, learning early how to read the weather in the sky and how to keep going when your body said stop. When the letter came, he folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer where his mother kept the family Bible. He told her he would be back before the harvest. She didn't answer. She only reached up and touched his face the way she had when he was small, as if trying to memorize it. At the train station the next morning, she pressed a small photograph into his hand, the whole family standing in front of the barn, everyone smiling because the camera had been a rare treat. He tucked it into the breast pocket of his uniform, right over his heart, and tried not to notice how her hand trembled when she let go. All across the country that spring, the same scene played out in different kitchens and on different front porches. Fathers who had fought in the last war stood silent, knowing there were no words that could prepare a son for what waited across the Pacific. Wives held babies on their hips and waved until the train disappeared, then went inside and cried where the children couldn't see. These were not dramatic goodbyes shouted from movie screens. They were ordinary people doing the hardest thing ordinary people are ever asked to do, letting go of someone they loved because the world had decided that freedom and safety required it. On the long voyage west, the same young Marine stood at the rail of the transport ship and watched the endless water roll past. The ocean felt bigger than anything he had ever imagined. At night the stars seemed close enough to touch, yet the darkness between them felt endless too. He wrote letters he couldn't mail yet, telling his girl back home that the food was better than he expected and that the guys in his squad were good men. He didn't write about the dreams that woke him, the ones where he was running through tall grass and couldn't find his way back to the road. Instead, he wrote about the photograph. He told her he looked at it every night before he tried to sleep, and that it helped. What he didn't say was that sometimes the photograph made the distance feel even greater, because the people in it were living a life that might already be moving on without him. The men around him carried their own photographs, their own letters, their own small talismans, a lucky coin, a rosary, a lock of hair tied with thread. They joked about home, about girls, about what they would do when the war was finally over. But beneath the jokes ran a current of something heavier. They had already seen friends die on earlier islands. They knew this fight would be different. Word had spread quietly among the veterans that the island ahead mattered more than any they had taken before. If they could secure it, American bombers would finally be able to reach Japan itself. The war that had felt so far away might suddenly come home to the enemy in a way that could force an end. That knowledge sat differently in a man's chest than ordinary fear. It mixed with a stubborn, almost angry hope that maybe, just maybe, this battle could spare the next generation the same journey. While those ships carried their human cargo across the Pacific, life on Saipan continued in its familiar rhythms, though the rhythms were growing strained. The island was beautiful in the way only tropical places can be, green hills rising from turquoise water, sugar-cane fields whispering in the trade winds. Villages where children still chased each other between the houses at dusk. Families there had lived under Japanese administration for decades. Some had come from Japan itself years earlier to farm or work in the small towns. Others were native islanders who had adapted to the schools, the language, the expectations of the empire. They planted, fished, celebrated festivals, and tried to keep their children safe from a war that had so far stayed at a distance. But the distance was shrinking. Air raid drills had become more frequent. Supplies of rice and fuel grew tighter. Men who had been called into the local defense forces came home with new lines around their eyes and less to say at the dinner table. Mothers began to notice how their older sons stood straighter when they thought no one was watching, as if practicing for something they didn't yet understand. In the evenings, families sometimes sat together listening to the radio, hearing the official voices speak of certain victory and the unbreakable spirit of the Japanese people. The words sounded strong, yet in the quiet that followed, parents often found themselves looking at their children a little longer than usual. One mother on Saipan, a woman whose husband had already been called away to serve, kept a small garden behind her house. She grew vegetables the way her own mother had taught her, and she taught her daughter to do the same. In the late afternoons they would work side by side, their hands in the warm soil, while the little girl chatted about school and the neighbor's new puppy. The mother would listen and nod, but sometimes her gaze would drift toward the horizon where the sea met the sky. She had heard the rumors. Everyone had. The Americans were coming. Not just to raid or to pass by, but to take the island. She didn't know what that would look like. She only knew that the world her daughter was growing up in was about to change in ways none of them could yet name. That shared uncertainty, the American mother at the train station and the Saipan mother in her garden, was the true measure of what made this island different. Previous battles had been fought over places that felt remote even to the people fighting for them. Saipan sat close enough to Japan that its capture would place American air power within striking distance of the enemy's home islands. For the young men on the transports, that meant the possibility of shortening a war that had already taken too many of their friends. For the families on Saipan, it meant the storm that had been circling the Pacific for years was finally about to break over their own rooftops and fields. Both sides carried the same unspoken question into the coming weeks: what will we have to give up so that our children might not have to give up everything? The letters continued to cross the ocean in both directions, though the ones from Saipan grew shorter and more careful. The ones from America grew more frequent, as if the writers sensed that time was running short. In one transport compartment, a group of Marines passed around a single dog-eared magazine someone had brought from home. They didn't talk much about what waited ahead. Instead, they talked about the food they missed, the girls they would marry, the farms or garages or corner stores they planned to return to. One man kept a small notebook where he wrote down the names of everyone in his squad. He told himself it was just in case, but he never showed it to anyone. On Saipan, the same kind of quiet preparation was happening in different ways. Families began moving extra rice and water into the backs of their homes or into nearby caves they had known since childhood. Some parents quietly sent older children to stay with relatives in what they hoped would be safer parts of the island. The official announcements continued to promise protection and victory, yet the eyes of the elders had begun to hold a different expression, the look of people who had already lived through too many promises that did not survive contact with reality. What none of them could fully know, on either side of the coming battle line, was how completely this one island would test the limits of human endurance and the meaning of sacrifice. The young Marine from the Heartland would soon discover that the photograph in his pocket could be both comfort and burden. The mother in her garden would soon learn that the drills she had practiced with her daughter were no longer practice. And the island itself, green, beautiful, ordinary, would become the place where two worlds that had never truly met would finally collide with a force that would echo across the rest of the war and long after it ended. These were not abstract questions of strategy or geography. They were questions of whether a mother would ever again hear her son's footsteps on the porch, whether a child would grow up knowing her father's voice, whether the long separation that had already begun would prove temporary or permanent. That was the weight the island carried before any shot was fired. That was why, for the men on the ships and the families waiting on both sides of the ocean, Saipan had become more than just another name on a map. It had become the place where the war might finally turn toward home, or where it might demand still more from people who had already given almost everything they had. If these stories of ordinary courage and the quiet strength of families separated by an ocean have moved you the way they move me, you might want to hold on to that feeling a little longer. There are powerful ways to keep these human moments close, authentic World War II memorabilia that lets you touch a piece of that history, or the film Midway, which brings the spirit and sacrifice of the Pacific Theater to life on screen in a way that honors the very people we've been talking about. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The ships kept moving west. The gardens on Saipan kept growing. And the photographs in pockets and on mantles continued to do what photographs always do in wartime. They held the faces of the people worth fighting for, worth surviving for, worth coming home to. The island ahead would test every one of those promises. But for now, in the long days at sea and the lengthening evenings on Saipan, the only certainty was that nothing would ever be quite the same once the two sides finally met on that green shore. And the young men who had left their families, and the families who had let them go, could only carry their hope and their fear across the water, 1 mile at a time, toward whatever waited on the other side. The men who sent others into battle rarely slept easily in the nights before the fighting began. They carried maps and reports the way other men carried photographs of their children, close to the heart, yet heavy enough to change the way they stood and the way they spoke when no one else was listening. The senior Marine commander had earned a reputation for ferocity long before this campaign. He had walked battlefields in earlier wars and watched good men die because someone higher up had hesitated or compromised. That memory shaped every decision he made now. In the small, humid cabin where he worked late into the night, he would spread the latest intelligence across the table and stare at it until the lines blurred. He knew what the coming fight would demand. He also knew that the only way to keep more of his Marines alive in the long run was to strike hard and fast from the first moment. Hesitation, he believed, was the luxury of men who had never seen what happened when an attack lost its momentum. Yet even as he planned the assault with that fierce clarity, there were moments when he would pause, light a cigarette with hands that were not quite steady, and think of the young officers who would lead the first waves. He had written letters to their families before. He hoped he would not have to write many more after this island was taken. What weighed on him most was not the enemy he could see on the maps. It was the quiet knowledge that this particular island mattered more than any they had fought for so far. If they could secure it, American bombers would finally be able to reach Japan itself. That single fact could change the entire arithmetic of the war. It could shorten the suffering, bring boys home sooner, spare the next wave of replacements the same journey across the ocean. But to reach that possibility, he had to ask the men he loved like sons to walk into the teeth of prepared defenses. He carried both hopes at once, the hope of ending the war and the certain knowledge of the price that would be paid in blood and grief before any ending came. A few decks away on the same ship, the overall naval commander lived with a different kind of burden. Where the Marine general burned with forward drive, this admiral moved with measured, almost careful thought. He had the entire fleet in his charge, the carriers that protected the transports, the battleships that would soften the beaches, the thousands of young men packed into the holds below. Every night he reviewed the latest reports from the submarines and the scout planes, looking not just for the enemy's strength but for any sign that the plan might cost more ships or more lives than the larger war could afford to lose. He understood that boldness without wisdom could hand the enemy a victory they did not deserve. Yet he also understood that too much caution could turn a hard fight into a longer, bloodier one. The weight he carried was the constant calculation of risk against reward, measured not in abstract numbers but in the faces of the men he had met on the decks and in the mess halls. He had seen their trust. He felt the responsibility of that trust like a hand on his shoulder that never quite lifted. When the two commanders met to finalize the plans, the air in the room could grow thick with the things they did not say out loud. They respected each other's experience. They shared the same goal, to take the island with as few American lives lost as possible. But they came from different services, different traditions, different ways of seeing the same problem. The Marine commander wanted speed and shock. The admiral wanted to make sure every supporting arm was in place before the first boat touched the sand. Those differences were not born of pride or rivalry alone. They were born of the different prices each man had already seen paid in earlier fights. When they disagreed, the tension was real, yet it was the tension of men who both knew that any mistake would be measured in the letters that would soon go home to mothers and wives. In those moments, the burden of command revealed itself not in raised voices but in the long silences that followed, when each man returned to his own thoughts and the maps that refused to give easy answers. On the Japanese side of the coming collision, the burdens were no less heavy, though they were carried in a different language of duty and honor. The senior commander on the island had spent his career preparing for this kind of fight. He walked the defensive positions day after day, speaking quietly with his officers, checking the placement of guns and the readiness of the men who would man them. He knew the island's terrain better than any map could show, the ridges that could hide machine guns, the caves that could shelter defenders until the last possible moment, the beaches that would become killing grounds the moment the Americans tried to land. He also knew that his resources were limited and that the enemy would come with overwhelming numbers. His task was not victory in the old sense. It was to make the cost so high, the resistance so stubborn, that the Americans might pause or that his own leaders might find room to negotiate before the war reached the home islands themselves. In the evenings, when the inspections were done and the reports had been read, he would sometimes sit alone with a small stack of letters from his family. He read them slowly, as if each word might be the last he would ever receive. He thought of his children growing up in a country that had already asked so much of its young men. He wondered what kind of future they would have if this island fell and the bombers that would follow reached the cities where his wife and parents still lived. He never spoke those thoughts to his staff. Instead, he spoke of resolve, of the spirit that had carried Japan through harder times, of the duty to hold until relief or victory came. But the men closest to him sometimes saw the weariness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. That weariness was the private price of command, the knowledge that he was asking men to die for a cause that might already be slipping beyond reach. The admiral who shared overall responsibility for the island's defense carried his own ghosts. He had once led forces that struck with devastating surprise. Now he found himself on the other side of that equation, trying to protect an island that could not be fully protected against the force the Americans were bringing. He moved among his officers with the same outward calm he had always shown, offering a word of encouragement here, a quiet correction there. Those small gestures mattered more than he knew. In a war that had already taken so many of the best and brightest, a moment of human kindness from a senior commander could steady a young officer who was quietly terrified of what the next weeks would bring. Yet even those kindnesses could not lift the deeper burden. He had seen how quickly the tide of war could turn. He understood that this battle might be one of the last real chances to change its direction. The responsibility of that understanding sat heavily on him in the long nights when sleep would not come. What connected these men across the ocean that separated them was not strategy or ideology alone. It was the simple, terrible truth that command in wartime meant carrying the lives of others as if they were your own. The American leaders believed that taking this island could bring the war to Japan's doorstep and perhaps force an end before the fighting reached the enemy's home soil in even bloodier fashion. The Japanese leaders believed that holding it could buy time, could raise the price high enough to make the enemy reconsider, could preserve some hope for a negotiated peace that would spare their nation total destruction. Both sides were sincere in that belief. Both sides were willing to spend the lives of young men to achieve it. And both sides would discover, in the weeks ahead, that the cost of those decisions would be measured not in maps or reports but in the quiet rooms where families waited for letters that might never arrive. There were moments when the weight became almost visible. A Marine general might stand at the rail of his ship at dawn, watching the horizon where the island waited, and feel the years he had spent building these young men into a fighting force pressing down on his shoulders like an extra pack. An admiral might close a folder of casualty estimates from earlier campaigns and sit for a long time with his eyes closed, remembering faces he would never see again. On the other side, a Japanese commander might walk the length of a beach at twilight, speaking to sentries who were little more than boys, and wonder how many of them would still be standing when the sun rose again. These were not the dramatic confrontations of legend. They were the private, human cost of leadership, the moments when a man had to decide whether the greater good he believed in justified the immediate suffering he was about to unleash. And yet, even in those lonely hours, there were small acts of grace that kept the burden from becoming unbearable. A senior officer might take the time to write a personal note to the family of a young lieutenant who had been killed in training, offering words that went beyond the official telegram. Another might share a quiet meal with his staff, not to discuss plans but simply to remind them that they were still human beings before they were commanders. These moments did not change the coming battle. They did not alter the mathematics of loss. But they reminded every man involved that the weight he carried was not his alone. It was shared, in different ways, by everyone who had sworn to see this war through to whatever ending it would bring. The island that waited ahead would test every one of those burdens in ways no map could predict. The orders that had been debated and refined in the quiet of cabins and command posts would soon meet the chaos of surf and sand and jungle. The leaders who had carried the responsibility of planning would soon carry the heavier responsibility of reacting when plans broke against reality. They would read the first reports from the beaches with the same mixture of hope and dread that had kept them awake for weeks. They would make decisions that would send more men forward or hold others back, knowing that each choice would echo in the homes and hearts of families they would never meet. And through it all, they would carry the private knowledge that they were doing what they believed was necessary, even when necessity felt indistinguishable from tragedy. Some truths about war are never fully captured in official photographs or the stories told afterward. The raw weight of command, the moments of doubt that leaders could never show their men, the harsh and unfiltered reality of what these decisions actually cost, those are the parts of history that often remain hidden. If you want to see the uncensored side of what these commanders and the men who followed them endured, there is a collection available that gathers the raw images and footage too restricted or too difficult to show in ordinary channels. It offers an unflinching window into the realities that shaped these battles and the human beings who carried them. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the ships continued their steady progress across the water and the defensive preparations on the island grew more urgent, the men who held the highest ranks understood one thing with painful clarity. The burden they carried would not grow lighter when the fighting started. It would only change form. The questions that had kept them awake, whether they had planned well enough, whether they had prepared their men for what was coming, whether the price would ultimately be worth the gain, would soon be answered not in conference rooms but in the first terrible hours of contact. And the answers, whatever they proved to be, would be written in the same language that had always defined command in this war, the language of young men sent forward and families waiting at home for news that might never come. The island that held Japan's fate in its hands was about to test every shoulder that had helped shape the plans to take it. And those shoulders, already bowed by months and years of difficult decisions, would soon learn just how much more they were expected to bear. Across thousands of miles of restless ocean, two worlds that had never truly met were already speaking to each other in whispers, whispers carried in the rustle of letters being written by lamplight, in the quiet conversations that stopped whenever someone new walked past, in the way mothers on one side of the world held their children a little tighter while young men on the other side stared at the same horizon and wondered what they would find when they reached it. On one of the big transports slicing through the Pacific swells, a young Marine sat on his bunk with a small pad of paper balanced on his knee. The compartment was crowded and hot, filled with the low murmur of men trying to sleep and the constant background hum of the engines. He had already written the date at the top of the page 3 times and crossed it out each time. What he wanted to say felt too large for the small lines on the paper. He began again anyway. "Dear Mom," he wrote, then paused, the pen hovering. He wanted to tell her that the food was decent and the guys were good company. He wanted to tell her that the ocean was bigger than anything he had ever imagined and that sometimes at night it felt like the whole world had turned to water. What he could not bring himself to write was that every day the ships drew closer to the island, the knot in his stomach grew tighter. He had heard the older men talking in low voices about what waited ahead. This one was different, they said. This one could reach all the way to Japan itself. If they took it, the bombers could finally strike the enemy's home cities. That possibility was supposed to be hopeful, and in a way it was. But it also meant the fighting would be harder, because the enemy would know what losing this place would cost them. The young Marine folded the letter without finishing it and tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt, right beside the photograph of his family standing in front of the house on a Sunday afternoon. He told himself he would finish it later, when he had found the right words. He already knew he might never find them. Nearby, a veteran who had already seen 2 other islands taken sat with his back against the bulkhead, cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that day. He did not talk much about what he had seen before. The new men respected that silence. But sometimes, when the compartment grew quiet, he would offer a small piece of advice that carried more weight than any shouted order. "Write the letter," he told the young Marine one evening, not looking up from the rifle. "Even if you don't mail it yet. The words you can't say out loud have a way of sitting heavy if you keep them inside too long." He spoke from experience, though he did not say so. He had learned on an earlier beach that some men carried their last words with them for weeks before they ever had the chance to put them on paper. The small kindness of that advice stayed with the younger man. It was the kind of gesture that did not change the coming battle but made the waiting feel a little less lonely. On the decks above, sailors moved through their routines with the steady rhythm of men who had crossed oceans before. They checked lines, scanned the horizon, and spoke in the shorthand of people who had learned to trust each other with their lives. Yet even among them the whispers traveled. In the quiet moments between watches, conversations turned to the same subject. This island was not just another stepping stone. It was close enough to the enemy's heart that taking it would change what the war could become. From its airfields, American planes could finally reach Japan without having to fight their way across half the Pacific again. That single fact sat differently in every man's chest. For some it was the first real hope they had felt in a long time, the possibility that the fighting might not drag on for years, that their younger brothers might not have to make this same crossing. For others it was simply one more reason to be afraid. If the island mattered that much to the enemy, then the enemy would defend it with everything they had left. The vast armada moved steadily westward, a floating city of steel and hope and fear. From a distance it looked unstoppable. Up close, on the decks and in the compartments, it was made of ordinary men carrying extraordinary burdens. They wrote letters they might never send. They looked at photographs until the edges softened from being handled too often. They shared cigarettes and stories and the kind of silence that only exists between people who know they might not all come back from what waits ahead. And through it all ran the same quiet understanding: this crossing was different from the ones before. The ocean they were crossing now was carrying them toward a place that could finally bring the war to the enemy's doorstep. That knowledge did not make the nights shorter or the fear smaller. It only made the purpose feel larger than any single man could hold by himself. While the ships moved across the water, life on Saipan continued in its familiar patterns, though the patterns were beginning to fray at the edges. In the small villages and along the edges of the sugarcane fields, families still woke before dawn, still tended their gardens, still sent children to school when the schools were open. Yet every conversation now carried an extra weight. Mothers spoke to each other in lowered voices while hanging laundry or drawing water. They did not always use the word invasion, but the word lived in the spaces between what they said. The young men who had been called into the local defense forces came home with dust on their clothes and new lines around their eyes. They ate the evening meal with their families and tried to answer their children's questions without letting the fear show in their voices. The children, sensing the change even when no one explained it, became quieter at night. They asked fewer questions about when their fathers would come home from work and more questions about whether they could sleep in the same room as their mothers. One mother on the island moved through her days with the same steady hand she had always used to prepare meals and mend clothes. She had lived on Saipan long enough to know its seasons and its moods. She knew which winds brought rain and which brought the sweet smell of the cane fields. Lately she had noticed a different wind, not in the air, but in the way people looked at the horizon. She kept a small radio in the corner of the main room, and sometimes in the evening she would turn it on low, listening to the official voices that spoke of strength and certain victory. The words were meant to reassure, yet after the radio was turned off the house often felt quieter than before. She would sit with her daughter on the small porch, the child's head resting against her shoulder, and watch the last light fade from the sky. In those moments she allowed herself to remember what the island had felt like before the war had grown so close. There had been festivals and market days and the ordinary arguments between neighbors that never lasted long. Now those memories felt like they belonged to another lifetime. She did not know what the coming days would bring, only that the life she had built for her child was about to be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. The whispers on Saipan were different from the whispers on the American ships, yet they carried the same undercurrent of change. On the ships, men spoke of the possibility that this battle could bring the war closer to its end. On the island, families spoke, when they spoke at all, of the certainty that the war had finally found them. Both sides carried photographs and letters. Both sides tried to hold on to small routines that made the unknown feel manageable for a little while longer. And both sides understood, in the quiet places of their hearts, that the ocean between them was no longer just water. It had become a bridge that would soon disappear beneath the weight of what was coming. There were moments when the two worlds seemed to touch across that distance without ever meeting. A young Marine on a transport might pull out his photograph at the same hour a mother on Saipan tucked her child into bed. Neither knew the other existed, yet they shared the same fragile hope that whatever happened next would not take everything from them. The Marine hoped the battle ahead would be the one that finally let him go home. The mother hoped the storm she felt approaching would somehow pass over her family or at least leave enough of their life intact that they could begin again. Those parallel hopes did not change the course of the ships or the preparations on the beaches. They simply existed, quiet and stubborn, in the hearts of ordinary people who had never chosen the war but had been chosen by it. The educational weight of those days was carried not in briefings or maps, but in the way people spoke to each other when they thought no one important was listening. The men on the ships understood that success here would place American air power within reach of Japan itself. That single fact could force decisions in Tokyo that might end the fighting before it reached the enemy's home soil in even more terrible ways. The families on Saipan understood that their island had become the place where that possibility would be decided. They did not need the language of strategy to feel the truth of it. They felt it in the way the young men of the garrison checked their weapons one more time before nightfall, and the way mothers began keeping extra water and rice in the back rooms of their homes. In the way the children stopped asking when the war would be over and started asking whether they would still have school tomorrow. Small acts of resilience kept the fear from swallowing everything. On the transports, men organized impromptu card games that lasted until someone finally laughed at a bad joke. On Saipan, neighbors helped each other reinforce the simple shelters they had dug behind their houses, sharing tools and quiet encouragement without needing to say why the work mattered. These were not heroic gestures meant for history books. They were the ordinary ways people reminded themselves that they were still human, still connected, still capable of kindness even when the world around them was preparing for its opposite. As the ships drew closer and the whispers on both sides grew harder to ignore, the ocean itself seemed to hold its breath. The young Marine who had started the letter so many times finally finished it one night when the compartment was mostly asleep. He wrote that he loved them all and that he was proud to be doing what he had been asked to do. He did not write that he was afraid. He did not need to. The fear was already understood by everyone who would read the letter if it ever reached them. On Saipan, the mother finished her evening chores and sat for a long time on the edge of her child's bed, listening to the steady breathing of sleep. She thought of all the ordinary days that had led to this one and wondered which of them she would remember most clearly if the days ahead took everything else away. She did not have words for the feeling that pressed against her chest. She only knew that the life she had known was ending, and that whatever came next would ask more of her than she had ever imagined she could give. These are the kinds of quiet, human moments that often disappear from the official stories of war, the letters written and never sent, the small kindnesses shared between strangers who might not survive the next week, the private fears that leaders and ordinary people carry together across the same ocean. Bringing these forgotten stories to light takes real time, careful research, and a genuine commitment to remembering the people behind the battles. If the intimate tension of these final days before everything changed has stayed with you, and you want to help keep more of these deeply human chapters alive for others to feel and understand, you can leave a small tip, even as little as $1, on Ko-Fi. It directly supports the work of uncovering and sharing these stories so they are not lost. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The armada kept moving. The island kept preparing. And across the water that still separated them, the whispers grew steadily louder, no longer content to stay in the quiet spaces between words. Soon those whispers would become shouts, and the two worlds that had been moving toward each other for so long would finally meet on the green shores and in the shadowed hills of a place neither side would ever forget. The young men on the ships and the families on the island could feel it coming in the same way a person feels a storm before the first rain falls, not with certainty of what would happen, but with the deep, unshakable knowledge that nothing would be the same once it arrived. And in that shared, wordless understanding, the last fragile distance between them began to disappear. The ramp dropped with a sound like the world cracking open, and in that single moment every man in the boat understood that the long crossing was over and the real price of this island was about to be paid in the surf right in front of them. They had come in low and fast through the early light, the landing craft bucking against the waves like something alive and angry. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of diesel and wet canvas and the sharper, metallic scent of fear that no one wanted to name. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, knees drawn up, rifles held across their chests or resting on their thighs. Some stared straight ahead at the gray metal ramp. Others kept their eyes on the small square of sky visible above the sides of the boat. A few had their lips moving in silent prayer or in the repetition of a name they hoped would keep them steady when the shooting started. One young Marine near the front had spent most of the ride trying not to think about the letter he had finally finished the night before. He had written it in the dim light of the compartment, the words coming out slower than he wanted them to. He had told his mother he was proud to be here, that the men around him were the best kind of people, and that he would write again as soon as he could. He had not told her that the older hands had been quiet in a way that made the new men nervous, or that the talk in the chow line had turned again and again to how this beach would be different from the others. He felt the folded paper against his chest now, tucked inside his shirt where the water would not reach it easily. It felt like the only solid thing left in a world that was about to come apart. Beside him, a veteran who had already waded onto one terrible beach months earlier kept his hand resting lightly on the young man's shoulder. He did not speak. There was nothing useful to say in the last minutes before the ramp fell. Instead, he offered the smallest of kindnesses, a steady presence, the quiet knowledge that someone who had already survived this kind of moment was sitting right there beside him. That touch, light as it was, carried more reassurance than any shouted order could have managed. The young Marine felt it and did not pull away. In the cramped boat, surrounded by the low murmur of engines and the slap of water against the hull, that small human contact was the only thing that kept the fear from swallowing him whole. When the ramp finally dropped, the world changed in an instant. The first thing that hit them was the noise, a wall of sound made of shell bursts, machine gun fire, and the strange, high-pitched whine of bullets passing close overhead. The second thing was the water. It was deeper than it had looked from farther out, and the surf was running hard, pulling at their legs and threatening to knock them off balance before they had taken 3 steps. They waded forward into it anyway, because there was nowhere else to go. The weight of their packs and weapons dragged at them. The rifles felt heavier than they ever had in training. Every man carried the same thought in some form: keep moving, do not stop, do not become a target that stands still long enough to be hit. The young Marine felt the first bullet strike the water around him before he even reached the sand. They made small, vicious splashes that looked almost harmless until one of them found flesh. The man just ahead of him went down without a sound, folding into the surf as if the ocean had simply decided to claim him. For a heartbeat the young Marine froze, the sight of it too sudden and too final to make sense. Then the veteran's voice cut through the noise, low and urgent and somehow calm. Keep going. We stop, we die here. The hand that had rested on his shoulder in the boat was now pushing him forward, not roughly, but with the steady force of someone who knew that hesitation in this moment was the same as giving up. The young Marine moved because he had been given a reason to move that was larger than his own fear. On the beach itself the chaos was worse than anything the boats had prepared them for. The sand was torn up by shell fire. Wrecked landing craft and obstacles lay half submerged or tilted at strange angles. Men who had made it out of the water were crawling or running in short, desperate bursts toward any scrap of cover. A knocked-out vehicle, a low rise of sand, the body of a friend who had already fallen. The enemy fire came in steady, disciplined bursts from hidden positions farther inland and from the flanks. It raked the waterline and the open stretch of beach without pause. There was no single direction to face. The danger seemed to come from everywhere at once. In the middle of that storm, small acts of courage and kindness kept appearing like flashes of light in heavy fog. One man, already wounded in the leg, turned back into the surf to help pull another who had gone under. He did it without thinking, without waiting for orders, because the alternative was to leave someone behind in the one place where being left behind meant certain death. Another Marine, barely more than a boy, found himself kneeling beside a stranger whose breathing had gone ragged and wet. He did not know the man's name. He only knew that the stranger's eyes were open and frightened and that someone needed to stay with him for whatever time was left. The young Marine stayed. He held the man's hand and spoke nonsense words about home and about how help was coming, even though he could not be sure of either. In the middle of the worst noise he had ever heard, that small, useless kindness felt like the only thing that still made sense. The veteran who had guided the young Marine off the boat moved through the same chaos with a different kind of steadiness. He had seen this before. He knew the shock that could freeze a man in place and the way that shock could spread like a sickness if someone did not break it. He moved from one knot of men to another, not giving orders so much as giving presence. A word here, a hand on a shoulder there, a shared look that said without words that they were still together and that together was the only way any of them were going to make it off this strip of sand. He did not feel brave. He felt old and tired and determined in a way that had nothing to do with heroics. He simply knew that if he kept moving and kept the men around him moving, the line would hold long enough for the next wave to come in and for the foothold to become something real instead of a collection of scattered, terrified survivors. The educational truth of that morning lived in those scattered moments rather than in any map or plan. This beach had to be taken because without it there would be no way to bring in the supplies, the reinforcements, and the heavy equipment needed to push inland toward the airfields. Those airfields were the reason this island mattered more than any they had fought for before. From them, American bombers could finally reach Japan itself. That possibility, the chance to bring the war to the enemy's doorstep and perhaps force an end before the fighting reached even bloodier ground, was what had brought every man in the boats across the ocean. But the price of that possibility was being paid right here, in the surf and on the sand, by young men who had never asked to be the ones to pay it. The human cost of strategic necessity was never abstract when you were the one wading through it. Time behaved strangely in those first hours. Some men would later say that everything slowed down until each second felt like a minute. Others would say the opposite, that whole stretches of the fight disappeared from memory, swallowed by the need to keep moving and shooting and surviving. The young Marine who had carried the unfinished letter experienced both at once. One moment he was helping drag a wounded man behind the cover of a wrecked boat while bullets kicked up sand around them. The next moment he was firing at shapes he could barely see through the smoke and dust, his hands working the rifle without any conscious command from his mind. In between those moments there were flashes of terrible clarity, the face of a friend who would not be getting up again, the way the water near the shore had turned a color no one wanted to name, the sound of someone calling for a medic in a voice that already knew help would not arrive in time. Yet even in the middle of that nightmare, the small human connections refused to die. Two men who had never spoken more than a few words to each other before the landing found themselves sharing the same shell hole. One of them had lost his canteen in the surf. The other passed his own without being asked. They did not exchange names. They simply nodded, the smallest possible acknowledgement that they were still alive and that being alive together was better than being alive alone. Later, when the immediate storm had eased enough for the next wave of boats to reach the shore, those same two men would help carry wounded back toward the waterline so the corpsmen could do their work. The kindness was practical, almost automatic, but it was also the only thing that kept the horror from turning every man into someone he would not recognize when the sun finally set. By the time the beach had been fought clear enough for a real toehold to exist, the cost was already written in the sand and in the surf and in the faces of the men who remained standing. The young Marine who had started the day with a letter in his pocket found himself sitting with his back against a low dune, his rifle across his knees, trying to make his hands stop shaking. The veteran who had guided him through the worst of it sat nearby, sharing a cigarette that tasted of salt and smoke and something else neither of them wanted to name. They did not speak of what they had just lived through. There would be time for that later, if they were lucky enough to have a later. For now they simply sat in the same exhausted silence that had settled over the strip of sand they had paid so much to claim. The island still rose ahead of them, green and waiting and full of unknown dangers. The airfields that could change the course of the war were still miles inland. But they had the beach. They had a place to stand. And in the strange arithmetic of that morning, that single fact felt like both a victory and a wound that would never fully close. What happened in those first terrible hours on the sand was too immediate, too raw, and too deeply human to be captured by any official report or carefully edited account. The chaos, the courage that appeared without warning, the small mercies that kept men from breaking completely, those realities live on most powerfully in the unfiltered memories of the men who survived them and in the images that show the truth without softening it. If the story of this baptism by fire has stayed with you and you want to go deeper into the uncensored side of what these men endured, there is a place where history lovers gather for raw footage, unblurred sections, exclusive podcasts, and conversations that explore the stories behind the battles we usually only see from a distance. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The foothold was fragile and the day was far from over, but the beach no longer belonged only to the enemy. It belonged, at least for now, to the men who had waded through fire and water to claim it. They had paid for every yard in ways that would stay with them long after the island itself was secured. And they knew, even in their exhaustion, that the real test of whether this terrible morning had been worth its price was still waiting in the hills and caves and fields ahead. The ocean behind them was already bringing more men and more supplies to the narrow strip of sand they had bought with blood and courage. The island ahead was still holding its secrets. Between those two truths, the survivors of the first wave sat in a sudden, ringing quiet that follows the worst noise a person can hear, and they waited for whatever came next. When the last light drained from the sky and the flares began to pop and drift like dying stars, the men who had fought all day to claim a strip of sand discovered that the real battle for the beachhead was only just beginning in the darkness that followed. They had spent the remaining hours of daylight digging. Not proper trenches, there had been no time for that, but shallow foxholes scraped out of the coral sand with helmets, bayonets, and bleeding hands. The wounded had been carried or dragged back toward the waterline where the first aid stations were forming. The dead had been left where they fell because moving them under fire cost more lives than anyone could spare. Now, as night swallowed the island, the living tried to find some way to rest while every nerve stayed awake. They ate cold rations if they ate at all. They checked their ammunition by feel. They spoke in low voices that stopped whenever a strange sound drifted out of the black jungle ahead of them. In one shallow depression near the edge of the sand, a young Marine sat with his back against the sloping wall of his foxhole, his rifle across his knees. His buddy, a man from the same small town who had joined up the same week, was pressed against the opposite side, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They had survived the landing together, had helped pull each other through the worst of the surf and the first hours on the beach. Now they shared the darkness the way they had shared everything else that day, without needing many words. The young Marine kept thinking about how quiet the jungle had become once the sun went down. It was not the peaceful quiet of home. It was the quiet of something waiting. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a branch, made his stomach tighten. He had heard stories from the older men about night attacks, how the enemy came in close, sometimes crawling, sometimes charging in sudden waves, using the darkness the way other men used cover. He had not believed the stories could be as bad as they sounded. Now, with the black pressing in on all sides, he was no longer sure. His buddy passed him a canteen without being asked. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was wet. That small act, the simple offering of water in the dark, carried more comfort than either of them could have put into words. It reminded them that they were not alone in this hole, that whatever came out of the night would have to come through both of them. The young Marine took a careful sip and handed the canteen back. In the brief moment their hands touched, neither spoke, but something passed between them that steadied the fear just enough to keep it from turning into panic. Farther down the line, a squad leader moved from hole to hole in a low crouch, checking on his men without making himself a target. He had already lost 2 good men that afternoon. He carried their faces with him now as he moved through the dark, along with the faces of the replacements who had arrived with the later waves and who were trying hard not to show how terrified they were. He stopped at each position long enough to offer a quiet word or a shared cigarette, the flare of the match carefully shielded by cupped hands. These were not grand speeches about duty or victory. They were the practical, human things that kept men from breaking when the darkness made every shadow look like an enemy. Stay low. Listen before you shoot. If you hear movement, call out first. The words were ordinary. The way he delivered them, calm, steady, as if the night were just another problem to be managed, mattered more than the words themselves. In the black, that calm was a kind of light. The first probes came not long after full dark. They were not the mass charges the stories had warned about. They were smaller, more careful, infiltrators slipping between positions, testing the lines, looking for weak spots. A flare would go up from somewhere behind the American lines, its harsh white light turning the world into a stark black and white photograph for a few seconds. In those brief, blinding moments, men would catch glimpses of shapes moving low through the grass or along the edge of the sand. Then the flare would die and the darkness would rush back in, thicker than before. The waiting was almost worse than the fighting. Every man in every hole imagined he could hear breathing that was not his own, or the soft scrape of a boot on coral. Some fired at shadows and immediately regretted it when the muzzle flash gave away their position. Others held their fire until they were certain, and then the certainty came too late. When the first real counterattack came, it arrived without warning and without mercy. One moment the night was only rustling leaves and the distant murmur of the sea. The next moment the air was full of shouts and the flat, ugly sound of automatic weapons and the heavier, deeper reports of rifles. The attackers came in waves, some firing as they ran, others moving in near silence until they were almost on top of the foxholes. The young Marine in the shallow hole felt the ground tremble before he saw anything. Then shapes materialized out of the dark, men running low, some with bayonets fixed, their faces caught for an instant in the light of another flare. He fired without thinking, working the bolt of his rifle by instinct, the spent casings hot against his skin as they ejected. His buddy was firing beside him, the two of them creating a small pocket of noise and light in the larger chaos. The fighting in those first minutes had nothing heroic about it. It was desperate and confused and intimate in the worst possible way. Men killed at arm's length. They grappled in the dark when ammunition ran low. They called out names that sometimes belonged to friends who were already gone. The young Marine felt something hot and wet splash across his face and did not know if it was his own blood or someone else's. He kept firing because stopping felt like the same thing as dying. When the first wave broke against the line and fell back into the darkness, the silence that followed was almost worse than the noise had been. It left room for the mind to catch up with what the body had just done. In the brief lulls between attacks, small mercies appeared again, the way they always did when men were pushed to the edge. A wounded Marine in a nearby hole called out for water. The squad leader who had been moving through the line earlier crawled over with a canteen, pressing it to the man's lips in the dark while keeping one hand on his shoulder so he would know he was not alone. The gesture cost time and exposed the squad leader to whatever might be crawling through the grass, but he did it anyway because leaving a man to die thirsty in the dark was not something he could live with. Elsewhere, two strangers who had never spoken before the landing found themselves sharing the last of their ammunition without being asked. They did not exchange names. They simply nodded in the flickering light of a distant flare and went back to watching the darkness, each knowing that the other's survival had become temporarily tied to his own. The Japanese soldiers who came out of the night carried their own burdens into the fight. They had been ordered to throw the invaders back into the sea before the beachhead could grow strong enough to support a deeper advance. For many of them, this was not a battle they expected to survive. They moved forward because the alternative, failing in their duty, was unthinkable in the world they had been raised to believe in. Yet even in their desperation, moments of unexpected humanity surfaced. A wounded attacker who had reached the edge of an American position was sometimes met not only with bullets but with a quick, final kindness from a man who could not bring himself to let another human being suffer without end. These were rare and terrible mercies, born of exhaustion and the strange intimacy of close combat, but they happened. They reminded everyone involved that the enemy in the dark was still made of the same fragile material as the men in the foxholes. As the hours crawled forward, the psychological cost of fighting in the dark began to show itself in small, telling ways. Men who had been steady all day started at every sound. Others grew unnaturally calm, their voices flat even when they were giving orders or calling for help. The young Marine in the shallow hole found himself whispering the same phrase over and over under his breath, not a prayer exactly, but a promise he was making to himself and to the man beside him. We hold. We hold until it gets light. The words did not change the reality of the night, but saying them out loud made the fear feel slightly smaller, slightly more manageable. His buddy heard him and answered with the same two words, their voices low and rough. In that exchange, something important passed between them, the recognition that they were no longer just two individuals trying to survive. They had become something larger and more necessary, a pair of men who would not let the darkness take the ground they had already paid for with blood. The night attacks were not random. They were the enemy's way of trying to erase the gains of the day before more men and more supplies could come ashore. If the beachhead collapsed in the dark, the long journey across the ocean and the terrible price paid in the surf would have been for nothing. The airfields that could finally bring American bombers within reach of Japan would remain out of reach. The possibility of shortening the war, of bringing the fight to the enemy's doorstep in a way that might force an end before even greater losses were suffered, would slip away. That larger truth lived in every foxhole and every shallow scrape in the sand, even when the men fighting there could not have put it into words. They were holding not just a strip of beach. They were holding the first fragile step toward everything that came after. By the time the sky began to show the first faint gray of dawn, the attacks had grown weaker and more scattered. The enemy had spent much of what he had to spend in the darkness. The beachhead, though battered and bloody, was still there. Men who had not expected to see the sun rise again found themselves blinking in the growing light, their faces streaked with dirt and cordite and things they would not name. The young Marine and his buddy were still in their hole. They had not slept. They had barely spoken in the last hours. But they were alive, and the ground beneath them was still American ground. The squad leader who had moved through the line all night was sitting a short distance away, his head bowed, one hand resting on the stock of his rifle as if he were too tired to let it go. Around them, other men were beginning to stir, checking their weapons, sharing what little water remained, tending to the wounded who had made it through the night. The cost of those hours would be counted later, in the quiet moments when there was time to feel what had happened. For now, the simple fact of survival and the fragile security of the beachhead were enough. The sun was coming up. The ocean behind them was already bringing more boats. And the island ahead, though still full of unknown dangers, was no longer completely beyond their reach. The night of steel and shadow had tested them in ways the daylight landing never could. It had stripped away illusions and left only the raw truth of what men were willing to endure for one another and for the larger purpose that had brought them across the water. That truth would stay with every survivor long after the island itself was secured and the war had moved on to other shores. The fighting that unfolded in those hours of darkness held truths that stayed hidden even from many who lived through them, the private terrors that could not be spoken, the split-second choices that saved or ended lives. The small acts of courage and mercy that never appeared in any official record. Those are the kinds of hidden stories that shaped this war in ways we are still only beginning to understand. If the raw human cost of holding the line through the night has stayed with you, and you want to explore more of the forgotten and secret chapters that decided the outcome of the larger conflict, there is a free email newsletter that delivers an exclusive ebook called The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives into espionage, overlooked heroes, and the hidden stories behind the battles we think we already know. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the light strengthened and the full scale of what the night had cost became visible, the men on the beachhead began the slow, exhausted work of preparing for whatever the new day would bring. They had held. That single fact, paid for in the dark with steel and courage and quiet human connection, had kept the possibility of reaching the airfields, and everything those airfields represented, alive. The real fight for the island was still ahead, but the first and most dangerous night had been survived. And in that survival, however fragile and costly, lay the beginning of everything that would follow. The sky above the island became a battlefield long before most of the men fighting on the ground even knew the full scale of what was happening overhead. In the ready rooms of the American carriers, the young pilots gathered in the hours before dawn. They sat in rows of metal chairs, flight suits already damp with the humidity that never left these waters, listening to the briefings that tried to turn the unknown into something manageable. Maps were spread on tables. Lines were drawn showing where the enemy fleet was believed to be. But every man in the room understood that maps and lines meant little once the engine started and the sky opened up. One pilot, barely old enough to have shaved regularly before the war, kept his hand in his pocket, fingers wrapped around a small photograph of his sister's wedding that he had carried on every mission since he left home. He did not look at it now. He simply needed to know it was there. Across the aisle, his wingman, a slightly older man who had already flown through the worst of the earlier campaigns, leaned over and offered a stick of gum without a word. The gesture was small, almost casual, but it carried the weight of everything they could not say out loud. They had flown together long enough to know that some mornings the only thing keeping fear at bay was the presence of someone who would watch your back when the tracers started crossing the sky. On the Japanese carriers, the scene was quieter but no less heavy. Many of the pilots who climbed into their cockpits that morning were young and had seen little real combat. Replacements rushed forward after earlier losses had gutted the experienced squadrons. They listened to their leaders speak of duty and of the chance to strike a decisive blow against the invasion fleet supporting the island fighting below. Some wrote quick letters they knew might never be delivered. Others simply sat with their eyes closed, trying to steady their breathing before the engines turned over. One young pilot, his hands still smooth from training rather than from months of combat, touched the photograph of his family one last time before climbing into the cockpit. He had been told that this battle could change everything, that if they could break the American carriers, the invasion of the island might falter and the war might still be kept at a distance from the home islands. He carried that hope with him as he strapped in, even though part of him already sensed how thin that hope had become. When the American pilots launched, the deck of the carrier felt both impossibly small and impossibly vast at the same time. The roar of the engines drowned out every other sound. The plane bucked as it accelerated, and then the deck fell away and there was only sky and sea and the knowledge that somewhere ahead other young men were climbing into the same sky with the same mixture of fear and determination. The formation gathered above the fleet like a living thing, planes sliding into their assigned positions with the practiced grace of men who had done this many times before. Below them, the ocean was dotted with the gray shapes of the invasion force still supporting the beachhead. The pilots knew their job was to protect that force and to find and destroy the enemy carriers before those carriers could launch their own strikes against the men who had already paid so much to hold a strip of sand. The first contact came as a sudden shift in the radio chatter and then, almost immediately, as the distant sparkle of sunlight on distant canopies. The Japanese formations were coming in waves, some aimed at the carriers, others seeking the transports and support ships near the island. The American pilots turned toward them without hesitation. In the cockpits, heart rates climbed and hands tightened on the controls. There was no time for grand thoughts. There was only the immediate need to close the distance, to get into firing position, to protect the men below who could not protect themselves from what was coming out of the sky. The battle that unfolded was unlike anything most of these young men had imagined when they first dreamed of flying. It was fast and brutal and strangely beautiful in the way that terrible things sometimes are. American pilots found themselves in swirling dogfights where the sky seemed filled with flashing wings and streaming smoke. A tracer round would arc past the canopy close enough to leave a burn mark on the memory. A wingman's plane would suddenly blossom into flame and then fall, leaving a thin black line of smoke against the blue. The young pilot who had carried his sister's photograph felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with every combat mission, but this time it was mixed with something colder. The enemy planes he was facing were often flown by men with far less experience than the veterans he had fought earlier in the war. That knowledge did not make the shooting easier. It only made the victory feel more like something that had been bought at a price the other side could no longer afford to pay. From the Japanese side, the same sky looked very different. The young pilot who had touched his family photograph before takeoff found himself in a fight he had trained for but was not truly prepared to face. The American fighters seemed to be everywhere at once. Their attacks were coordinated in ways that felt almost unfair. He twisted and dove and climbed, doing everything his training had taught him, and still the tracers found their way toward him. In those moments he thought not of strategy or of the larger war, but only of the simple, human things, the face of his mother, the sound of his little brother's laughter, the girl he had promised to write to when he returned. He managed to damage one American plane before his own aircraft was hit. The controls went slack in his hands. The sea rushed up to meet him. In his last seconds he thought of the photograph still in his pocket and hoped someone would find it and understand that he had tried. On the American carriers, the men who stayed behind waited in a different kind of tension. They listened to the radio calls that crackled in and out of clarity. They watched the sky through binoculars and tried to count the planes that returned. Every missing aircraft meant a friend or a wingman who would not be coming back to the ready room. When a plane landed safely, the relief was physical, a loosening in the chest that lasted only until the next launch was ordered. The young pilot who had shared gum with his wingman before takeoff returned from one mission with his plane damaged and his face streaked with sweat and cordite smoke. He climbed out, gave a short debrief, and then sat on the edge of the flight deck with his head in his hands for a long time. His wingman had not come back. The two men had flown together since training. They had shared letters from home, bad jokes, and the quiet understanding that each was the only person who truly knew what the other was carrying. Now there was only an empty bunk and a silence that no amount of engine noise could fill. The battle raged through the long day and into the following night as American forces pursued the retreating Japanese fleet. Pilots flew mission after mission until exhaustion made every movement feel like it was happening underwater. They landed on carriers that had become floating hospitals and armories at the same time. They ate standing up, slept in their flight suits when they could sleep at all, and carried the weight of every friend who did not return. Yet even in the middle of that grinding exhaustion, small moments of human connection kept appearing. A pilot who had just watched his squadron leader go down shared his last cigarette with a mechanic who had worked through the night to keep his plane flying. Two young aviators who barely knew each other found themselves talking quietly about home while they waited for the next launch, their voices low so the fear would not carry. These were not grand gestures. They were the ordinary ways men reminded themselves that they were still human even when the sky was trying to turn them into something else. What was happening above the island was not separate from what was happening on the ground. While the Marines and soldiers on the beachhead were still digging in and fighting off night attacks, the battle in the sky was deciding whether that beachhead would be allowed to grow or whether it would be strangled from above. The Japanese carriers had hoped to strike a blow that would force the invasion fleet to withdraw. Instead, their air groups were being systematically destroyed. The American pilots, flying planes that could be replaced and trained in numbers the enemy could no longer match, were breaking the back of Japanese naval aviation in a single extended engagement. That victory did not end the fighting on the island. It simply removed one of the most dangerous threats to the men who were still trying to expand their foothold. From that point forward, the ground battle would be fought without the constant fear of major air attack from the sea. The path toward the airfields that could finally reach Japan itself remained open. The cost of that shift was paid in the cockpits and in the empty bunks back on the carriers. Every American pilot who returned carried the memory of planes going down in flames. Every Japanese pilot who survived carried the knowledge that the balance of power in the sky had changed in ways that could not be reversed. The young American who had lost his wingman sat on the flight deck after his last mission of the battle and wrote a letter he knew he would have to deliver to a family he had never met. He wrote about courage and about friendship and about how his wingman had saved lives on the ground by helping to clear the sky. He did not write about the emptiness that had taken up residence in his chest. Some things could not be put into words even when there was paper and time. When the last Japanese planes had been driven off or destroyed and the American fleet turned its attention fully back to supporting the island fighting, the pilots who had lived through the battle gathered in their ready rooms once more. They were quieter than they had been before the first launch. Some stared at the empty chairs. Others spoke in low voices about what they had seen and what it might mean for the days ahead. The larger truth was becoming clear even to men who had never studied strategy. The sky that had rained fire and steel had also rained a kind of certainty. The invasion force on the island below would not be driven back into the sea by air power. The beachhead would continue to grow. The push inland toward the airfields that could change the entire direction of the war would continue. And the young man who had fought in that sky would carry the memory of what it had cost, and friends lost, and planes destroyed, and the sudden, terrible intimacy of aerial combat for the rest of their lives. The stories of those hours in the air deserve to be remembered not only in words but in the images and artifacts that let us see and feel what these young pilots endured. If the courage and the loss and the unbreakable bonds formed in those cockpits have moved you, there are powerful ways to keep that connection alive. Authentic World War II memorabilia from the Pacific Theater and the film Midway on Prime Video offer a chance to see the men and the machines and the stakes in a way that honors everything they gave. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the carriers turned back toward the island and the last damaged planes were repaired or written off, the men who had fought in the sky understood that their part of the larger battle was not finished. The ground fighting was still raging. The airfields that had been the true prize were still in enemy hands. But something fundamental had changed in those hours of fire and steel. The Japanese fleet could no longer seriously contest control of the air over the invasion. The American pilots who had lived through the battle would fly again in the days to come, protecting the men below as they pushed inland. And the young men on both sides who had climbed into their cockpits with photographs in their pockets and fear in their hearts had written another chapter in a war that was slowly, painfully, being decided one sky and one beach at a time. The island below was still contested. But the sky above it now belonged, more than ever, to those who had paid the highest price to claim it. The beach was only the beginning. Ahead of them, rising from the green heart of the island, lay the real reason so many had crossed the ocean and paid the price in the surf and the dark, the long, flat strips of ground that could finally bring American bombers within reach of Japan itself. They moved inland in the days after the beachhead had been secured, not in one great rush but in the steady, grinding way that men advance when every yard costs something. The terrain changed as they left the sand behind. Sugar-cane fields gave way to low hills and scattered villages. The heat pressed down like a living thing, and the air smelled of earth and smoke in the sharp, metallic scent that always followed artillery. Men who had spent the night before fighting off attacks in the dark now walked with the same rifles, the same packs, but with a new kind of tiredness in their bones. They had won the beach. Now they had to win the ground that would make that victory matter. In one rifle company moving through a stretch of broken cane, a young Marine walked with his squad, his eyes never quite still. He had survived the landing and the night that followed, but the faces of the men who had not were still with him. He kept thinking about the airfield that waited somewhere ahead. The older hands had talked about it in low voices during the brief lulls, how taking it would change everything. From those runways, bombers could reach Japan. That single fact had carried men across thousands of miles of water and through the worst hours any of them had ever known. Now it was close enough to touch, and the knowing made every step both heavier and more necessary. His squad moved carefully, using the edges of the fields for what little cover they offered. Japanese resistance had not ended with the beach. Small groups of defenders fought from every fold in the ground, from the edges of villages, from positions they had prepared long before the first American boot touched the sand. The fighting was close and sudden. A burst of fire from a hidden machine gun would pin a squad down for minutes that felt like hours. Then someone would find a way around or through, and the advance would continue until the next pocket of resistance appeared. There was no single dramatic charge. There was only the patient, exhausting work of clearing one position after another while the sun climbed higher and the weight of packs and weapons grew with every yard. The young Marine felt the exhaustion in his legs and in a dull ache behind his eyes, but he also felt something else, a quiet, stubborn determination that had not been there on the beach. Capturing the airfield was no longer an abstract idea discussed in briefings. It was the reason his friends had died in the surf and in the dark. It was the thing that might keep other young men from having to make the same crossing. That thought lived in the back of his mind as he moved from one patch of cover to the next, and it gave him a reason to keep going when his body wanted to stop. Farther ahead, closer to the airfield itself, the fighting grew more desperate. Japanese defenders understood what the runways represented. They had been ordered to hold or, if holding became impossible, to destroy what they could so the enemy could not use it. They fought with the fierce determination of men who knew that losing this ground would bring the war closer to their homeland than it had ever been before. American infantry advancing toward the field encountered positions that had been prepared with care, machine guns sighted to cover the approaches, artillery that could reach the open ground around the runways, and small groups of soldiers willing to fight until they could fight no more. In one such advance, a squad found itself pinned down short of the airfield's edge by fire coming from a cluster of buildings and a low ridge beyond. The men lay in the cane, the tall stalks offering little real protection, and waited for the moment when someone would have to move. The squad leader, a man who had already been wounded once on the beach but had refused evacuation, crawled from position to position, checking on his men and trying to find a way forward. He did not raise his voice. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, the way a man might speak to friends in a difficult moment. "We can't stay here. They'll bring more fire down on us if we do. We move on my signal. Watch your buddy. Don't stop until you're behind something solid." When the moment came, the squad rose and moved. The young Marine from the earlier company was not with them, but the same kind of men were, ordinary soldiers carrying the same mixture of fear and resolve. One man was hit almost immediately and went down hard. Another stopped without being ordered, grabbed the wounded man under the arms, and dragged him the last few yards to cover while bullets kicked up dirt around them. It was not a grand act of heroism. It was the automatic response of someone who could not leave another man behind in the open. The squad leader used the brief confusion to push forward with two others, flanking the position that had been holding them. The fighting there was close and ugly, the kind that left men with memories they would carry for the rest of their lives. When it was over, the ridge was quiet and the way to the airfield was a little more open. By the time the first American units reached the edge of the field itself, the runways were already damaged. Japanese engineers and soldiers had done what they could to crater the surfaces and wreck the facilities. But the field was there, long, flat stretches of ground that had once been used by Japanese aircraft and that now represented the single most important objective on the island. The men who first stepped onto that contested ground felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was relief that they had reached it. There was grief for the men who had fallen on the way. And there was a growing sense of what this place could become if they could hold it and make it work. The engineers arrived while the fighting was still going on around the edges of the field. They came in with their equipment and their determination, moving into areas that were not yet fully secure because the runways could not wait. Their job was to turn a battlefield back into an airfield as quickly as possible. They worked under fire, filling craters, clearing wreckage, and preparing surfaces while snipers and occasional artillery reminded them that the enemy had not given up on denying this prize. One engineer team found itself working on a section of runway while a firefight continued less than 100 yards away. They did not stop. They had been told what this field meant, that once it was operational, bombers could take off from here and reach Japan. That knowledge turned every hour of dangerous, exhausting work into something larger than themselves. The men on the ground felt the same weight. Infantry who had cleared the last pockets of resistance around the field sat in whatever cover they could find and watched the engineers work. Some of them wrote quick notes in the brief lulls, letters that might reach home or might not. One young soldier, his hands still shaking from the fight that had brought him to the edge of the runway, pulled out a small pad and tried to put into words what the day had meant. He wrote about the men who had not made it this far. He wrote about the hope that this strip of ground might bring the war closer to an end. He did not finish the letter. There was no time. But the act of trying to put the feeling into words helped steady something inside him that the fighting had shaken loose. As the engineers continued their work and more infantry pushed past the field to secure the ground beyond it, the larger meaning of what was happening began to settle over the men who had survived the advance. This was not just another piece of ground. This was the place that could finally bring the war to Japan's doorstep in a way that previous victories had not. From these runways, long-range bombers could take off with payloads that could reach the enemy's home islands. That possibility had been the strategic reason for choosing this island in the first place. Now it was becoming real. The cost had been high, and lives lost on the beach, in the nights of fighting in the dark, and in the hard push inland. But the prize was in American hands, and the engineers were already turning it from a contested battlefield into something that could change the direction of the war. The Japanese defenders who had fought so hard to hold or destroy the field had understood its importance as well. Their resistance had been fierce because they knew what losing it would mean. For the American soldiers and Marines who had taken it, the capture represented both an ending and a beginning. The beachhead was no longer just a toehold. It was a base from which the next phase of the campaign could be launched. The airfields that had been the true objective were now within reach of being used. And the men who had paid the price to get here carried that knowledge with them as they prepared for whatever came next. The work of making the runways usable again happened under conditions that most official accounts never captured: the constant threat of fire from positions that had not yet been cleared, the exhaustion of men who had already fought through days and nights without real rest, and the quiet determination of engineers who kept working even when every hour brought new danger. Those raw, unfiltered realities of turning a battlefield into an airbase are part of what made this moment matter. If the human cost and the stubborn courage that went into securing and repairing this airfield have stayed with you, and you want to see the harsher, uncensored side of what these men endured, there is a digital collection available that gathers raw images and footage too difficult or too restricted to show in ordinary channels. It offers an unflinching look at the realities that shaped these battles. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the first American aircraft were able to use the repaired sections of the field, the island had changed in ways that went beyond any single position. The race for the runways had been won. The hope that had carried so many men across the ocean, the hope that this island could bring the war within striking distance of Japan and perhaps force an end before even greater losses were suffered, was now closer to becoming reality. The fighting was far from over. There was still ground to be taken and defenders who would not yield easily. But the airfield that had been the true prize was in American hands, and the engineers who had worked under fire had already begun the work of turning it into the weapon it was always meant to be. The men who had fought their way to this place sat in the growing quiet around the edges of the field and allowed themselves, for the first time in many days, to believe that the terrible price they had paid might actually lead somewhere worth reaching. The moment the order came down, it felt as if the ground itself had shifted beneath the men who had been fighting side by side. They had crossed the same ocean, faced the same beaches, and endured the same nights of steel and shadow. Now, in the middle of the hardest fighting any of them had known, something inside the brotherhood that held them together cracked. The senior Marine commander had watched the advance stall in the center of the island. He carried the weight of the entire campaign on his shoulders, the need to secure the airfields that would finally allow bombers to reach Japan, the knowledge that every day of delay gave the enemy more time to strengthen his defenses, and the growing certainty that the men in the middle were not moving with the urgency the larger mission demanded. He had seen too many campaigns where hesitation on one part of the line had cost lives on every other part. The decision he made was not born of personal dislike. It was born of the cold arithmetic of war. If one division could not or would not press forward with the speed required, then the entire effort risked grinding to a halt while more young men died for ground that should already have been taken. When the order relieving the Army Division's commander reached the men in the foxholes, it arrived like a sudden, cold wind. The soldiers of that division had been fighting hard. They had taken casualties. They had pushed through difficult terrain against an enemy who was learning to use every fold in the ground and every cave mouth to slow the advance. Many of them believed they were doing everything that could reasonably be asked of tired men who had already endured the landing and the nights that followed. To hear that their own general had been removed in the middle of the battle felt like a judgment not just on their leader but on them. In the shallow holes and behind the low ridges, conversations that had once been about the next objective or the chances of getting mail soon turned quiet and bitter. One young Army soldier sat with his squad after the news spread. He had joined the division back in training and had come to respect the way his officers led, steady, careful, unwilling to waste lives on reckless pushes. Now he stared at the dirt between his boots and tried to make sense of what had happened. "They're saying we're not moving fast enough," he said finally, his voice low so it would not carry. "Like we're the ones holding everything up." His squad leader, a man who had already lost friends on the beach, shook his head. "It ain't us they're blaming. It's the old man." "But it feels the same, don't it?" The young soldier nodded. He did not know the full reasons behind the decision. He only knew that the man who had been responsible for their lives had been taken away at the worst possible moment, and that the Marines who were supposed to be their brothers in this fight now looked at them differently, or at least that was how it felt in the sudden silence that had fallen over the lines. On the Marine side, the reaction was just as complicated. Many of the men who had been fighting alongside the Army division understood the frustration of the senior commander. They had watched the center lag while they themselves pushed forward on the flanks, and they had felt the growing danger of an exposed line. Yet when the relief became known, even some of the most aggressive Marines felt a pang of something that was not quite sympathy and not quite satisfaction. One Marine corporal who had been coordinating with an Army platoon during the advance sat in his hole that evening and wrote a short letter he knew he might never send. He wrote about the men he had fought beside, how they had shared water and ammunition and the kind of quiet courage that did not need to announce itself. He did not write about the relief. He could not find the words. But the fact that he felt the need to put something on paper at all told him that the fracture running through the command had reached all the way down to the men who actually had to carry out the orders. The human cost of that fracture showed itself in small, telling ways over the following days. Trust that had been built through shared danger began to fray at the edges. Army soldiers who had been willing to take risks based on orders from their own chain of command now hesitated, wondering whether the next push would be seen as too slow or too reckless. Marines who had previously looked to the Army units on their flanks for support now wondered whether those units could be counted on when the pressure grew. The enemy, of course, did not pause to consider any of this. Japanese defenders continued to fight from every position they could hold, using the terrain and their own growing desperation to make every yard costly. The men on the ground still had to advance, still had to clear caves and ridges, still had to watch their friends fall. But they did it now with an extra weight, the knowledge that the people who were supposed to be on their side were also fighting each other in ways that could not be seen from the outside. In one forward position where Army and Marine units were still operating close together, a small moment of ordinary humanity pushed back against the larger tension. A Marine runner bringing a message to an Army company command post found the lieutenant in charge sitting with his head in his hands after a particularly hard day of fighting. The Marine could have delivered the message and left. Instead, he sat down on an ammunition crate and offered the lieutenant a cigarette from a pack that was already half empty. They did not talk about the relief. They talked about the terrain ahead and the chances of getting hot food sometime soon. When the Marine finally stood to go, the lieutenant looked at him and said quietly, "Tell your people we're still here. We're still moving." It was not a grand reconciliation. It was simply two men who had seen too much death in too short a time refusing to let the fracture between their services turn them into strangers. The senior commanders on both sides carried their own private burdens through the controversy. The Marine general who had made the decision knew that relieving another commander in the middle of a battle would be remembered long after the island itself was secured. He had done what he believed the larger mission required, the rapid seizure of the airfields that would bring bombers within range of Japan. But he also understood that the men whose lives were being spent had a right to expect that their leaders would stand together. The Army general who was relieved carried the sting of public judgment at a moment when his division was still in the fight. He had led his men through the landing and the early days of the advance with the steady hand they had come to expect. To be told, in effect, that his leadership was no longer sufficient was a wound that went deeper than any official report could measure. What made the fracture so painful was that it happened among men who had already paid so much together. The beach had been taken at terrible cost. The nights of fighting in the dark had tested every limit of endurance and courage. The push inland toward the airfields had already claimed more lives than anyone wanted to count. In the middle of all that, the sudden removal of a division commander felt like a betrayal not of one man but of the idea that the different services were truly fighting as one. The soldiers and Marines who had to keep moving forward after the news reached them did not have the luxury of debating the larger questions of doctrine or personality. They had to dig new holes, clear the next ridge, and watch for the enemy who was still very much present. Yet the fracture remained, a quiet ache beneath the louder demands of survival. The educational weight of that day lived in the way ordinary men experienced a decision made far above their heads. They did not see the maps or the pressure from higher command. They did not know the full strategic calculation that the airfields had to be taken quickly if the war was ever to reach Japan's doorstep in a way that might force an end. What they saw was their own general gone, their own service questioned, and the uncomfortable truth that even in the middle of a common fight, old rivalries and different ways of making war could still divide brothers who should have been standing shoulder to shoulder. That truth did not stop the advance. It did not change the fact that the island still had to be taken. But it left marks on the men who lived through it, marks that would stay long after the last shot was fired and the last airfield was operational. These are the kinds of painful, human moments that often disappear from the larger story of a battle, the quiet fractures inside an alliance. The way a single command decision could shake the trust of thousands of men who were already carrying more than anyone should have to bear. Keeping these stories alive, so that future generations can understand not just what happened but how it felt to the people who lived it, requires real-time, careful research, and a genuine commitment to remembering the full human cost of war. If the story of this fracture, and the way it tested the brotherhood of men who had already given so much, has stayed with you, and you want to help support the work of bringing more of these forgotten chapters to light, you can leave a small tip on Ko-Fi, even as little as $1. It goes directly toward sustaining the research and the dedication it takes to tell these stories with the care they deserve. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the days that followed the relief, the men on the ground did what soldiers have always done when leadership changes in the middle of a fight. They adapted. They continued to move forward, to clear the ground, to watch out for one another across the old service lines whenever the immediate danger made those lines seem less important than survival. The airfields that had been the true objective of so much of the fighting were still ahead, still contested, still worth every painful step. The fracture in the command had not broken the larger purpose that had brought every man to this island. It had only shown how fragile even the strongest brotherhood could become when the pressure grew great enough and the stakes high enough. The island was not finished with them yet. The caves and the ridges and the final desperate stands were still waiting. But the men who had lived through the day when their own leaders turned on each other carried a new understanding into that future fighting. The understanding that the enemy outside was not the only force capable of wounding them, and that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones fought inside the family of arms that was supposed to protect them. The green hills that had looked almost gentle from the beach now revealed their true nature as the men moved forward, not open ground to be crossed, but a honeycomb of darkness where the last organized resistance of an empire had gone to ground. They had taken the airfield. The runways were being patched and prepared even as the fighting continued around them. But the island was not finished with them. Ahead lay a broken landscape of ridges and draws and sudden cave mouths that seemed to breathe cool air one moment and smoke the next. The Japanese defenders who had not died on the beaches or in the night attacks had withdrawn into these places, turning the very earth into a weapon. What had been a battle for ground became something older and more terrible, a fight inside the bones of the island itself, where light ended and every step forward required a man to leave the world he understood behind. A young Marine who had already survived the landing and the nights that followed found himself part of a small team tasked with clearing one such position. He had grown used to the open fighting, to the way you could see the enemy coming or at least guess where the next burst of fire might come from. The cave was different. It swallowed sound and light and hope in equal measure. He stood at the entrance with two other men, the flamethrower heavy on his back, and felt the cool air against his face like a living thing that had been waiting for them. Inside, someone was still alive. They could hear movement, the scrape of equipment, the low murmur of voices that stopped whenever the Americans called out for surrender. The calls were answered only by silence or, once, by a single rifle shot that ricocheted past the entrance and buried itself in the dirt. The young Marine had been told what to do. He had practiced it. He had seen what happened when men tried to talk defenders out of caves and were met with grenades or sudden rushes instead. Still, he hesitated. The darkness inside did not feel empty. It felt occupied by people who had already decided they would not come out alive. He thought of the letters he had written home after the beach, the ones that tried to sound brave and finished. He had not written about this part. He was not sure he ever could. When the order came to clear the cave, he stepped forward because stopping would have been worse than going in. The flamethrower felt like both a shield and a curse as he moved into the black. The first burst of flame lit the interior for a few terrible seconds. The cave was not empty. Men were crouched along the walls and deeper in the shadows, some already wounded, some still holding rifles. The fire reached them before any of them could fully react. The screams that followed were not the sounds of soldiers in battle. They were the sounds of human beings discovering that the thing they had been told would never happen was happening now. The young Marine kept the trigger down longer than he needed to because stopping felt like inviting death to step out of the dark and take him instead. When the flame finally died, the cave was filled with smoke and the smell of burned cloth and burned flesh and something else that would stay in his memory long after the war ended. He backed out coughing, his eyes streaming, and sat on the ground outside while another man went in to finish what had been started. Nearby, another team faced a different kind of horror. This cave had a narrow entrance that widened into a larger chamber. The Japanese inside had prepared it well, sandbags, a machine gun positioned to sweep the entrance, and men willing to die rather than surrender. The Americans tried grenades first. The explosions echoed strangely inside the rock, and for a moment there was silence. Then the machine gun opened up again, the bullets chewing at the rock around the entrance. One of the Marines was hit in the shoulder and went down hard. His squad leader, a man who had already lost too many friends on this island, dragged him back out of the line of fire while another man provided covering fire. The kindness was automatic, the kind that happens when men have fought together long enough that saving each other becomes reflex rather than choice. They got the wounded man behind a rock and the squad leader pressed a field dressing against the wound with hands that did not shake until the job was done. Inside the cave, the Japanese defenders were running out of options. One of them, a young soldier who had been on the island since before the invasion, crouched behind the sandbags with the others and listened to the Americans calling for surrender again. He had been raised to believe that capture was worse than death, that his family would be shamed if he allowed himself to be taken. He had seen what happened to men who tried to give up in earlier fights, the way some of his own side had turned their weapons on anyone who seemed ready to quit. Yet in the smoke and the darkness, with the sound of the flamethrower still echoing from the cave next door, he found himself thinking of his mother's garden and the way the light fell through the paper screens in the evening. Those thoughts did not change what he had been ordered to do. They only made the waiting harder. When the Americans finally forced their way in, the fighting was close and ugly. There was no room for the kind of battle that happened in open fields. Men grappled in the dark, using knives and rifle butts and bare hands when ammunition ran out. The young Japanese soldier fired until his weapon was empty, then reached for the grenade he had been saving. He did not throw it at the Americans. He pulled the pen and held it against his chest because that was what he had been told a man did when there was no other way left. The explosion was muffled by his body and by the rock walls. The Americans who reached him found only what was left. Outside, the squad leader who had dragged his wounded man to safety sat with his back against the rock and tried to light a cigarette with hands that would not quite cooperate. The young Marine with the flamethrower sat nearby, staring at nothing. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing useful to say. They had done what the island required of them. They had cleared another position so the advance could continue toward whatever came next. But the cost of that clearance sat between them like a third man who would not leave. The psychological weight of cave fighting did not end when a position was taken. It followed the men into the next day and the day after that. They began to see every shadow as a potential threat. They learned to listen to the ground for the sound of digging or movement that might mean another entrance or another tunnel. Some of them started carrying extra grenades or extra fuel for the flamethrowers, not because they had been ordered to, but because the darkness had taught them that mercy could be fatal. Others found themselves writing letters in the brief lulls, not the cheerful ones they had sent after the beach, but shorter, more careful notes that tried to explain without explaining what they had seen and done inside the earth. One such letter was written by the squad leader who had saved his wounded man. He sat with a small pad on his knee and tried to put into words the thing that had been growing inside him since the first cave. He wrote about the men who would not come out and the men who had no choice but to go in after them. He wrote about the difference between killing in the open, where you could at least pretend it was distant, and killing in a place where you could smell the other man's fear and hear his last breath. He did not send the letter. He folded it and put it in his pocket with the others he had never mailed, because some things were too heavy to ask anyone else to carry. On the other side of the same darkness, the few Japanese soldiers who survived the cave fighting carried their own burdens into whatever time they had left. Some had been ordered to hold until they could hold no longer and then to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. Others had simply run out of places to go and had chosen the caves because the alternative was to die in the open under artillery and air attack. In the brief moments between assaults, they sometimes spoke of home in voices that had grown hoarse from smoke and shouting. They shared what little water and food remained. They wrote final messages on whatever scraps of paper they could find, messages that would almost certainly never reach the people they were meant for. These were not the actions of fanatics in the way the word is often used. They were the actions of ordinary men who had been given no acceptable way out and who were trying to meet an impossible end with some measure of dignity. The Americans who eventually cleared those positions found evidence of that dignity in strange places: a carefully folded uniform left in a corner, a photograph of a family placed where it would not be damaged by the fighting, a letter that had been started and never finished because the writer had run out of time. These small human details did not change what had to be done. They only made the doing of it heavier. The men who had to use flamethrowers and grenades and rifles at arm's length carried the memory of those details long after the caves were quiet. They learned that the enemy they had been taught to hate was capable of the same small kindnesses and the same private fears that lived inside their own hearts. As the advance continued and more caves were found and cleared, the men began to understand something that went beyond tactics or orders. The empire that had sent these defenders to this island had already lost the larger war in any practical sense. The airfields were being prepared. The bombers that could reach Japan were coming closer every day. What remained in the caves was not a strategy that could still win. It was the last breath of something that could not accept defeat and therefore could not allow its soldiers any path except the one that ended in death. The Americans who were forced to walk that path with them paid a price that could not be measured in ground gained or positions taken. They paid it in the quiet hours after the fighting, when the smoke cleared and the only sounds were the wind moving through the broken cane and the distant murmur of the sea that had brought them all here. The caves did not surrender easily, and the men who cleared them did not remain unchanged. They had entered the darkness as soldiers who still believed, in some corner of their hearts, that there was a difference between what war required and what it destroyed. They came out knowing that the difference was smaller than they had wanted it to be. The resilience that kept them moving from one cave to the next was real. The courage that allowed them to step into places where every shadow could kill was genuine. But the cost of that resilience and that courage was written in the way they no longer looked at each other quite the same, in the way they spoke less about what they had seen, and in the letters they wrote and did not send. The Empire's last breath had been taken in those dark places, but it had not left without taking something from the men who had been sent to claim it. What happened inside those caves, the raw fear, the desperate stands, the moral weight carried by every man who entered and every man who refused to leave, is part of the story that official accounts often soften or leave in shadow. The unfiltered reality of what these soldiers endured on both sides lives on most powerfully in the memories they carried and in the images that show the truth without turning away. If the human cost of clearing those hidden places has stayed with you and you want to explore the deeper, uncensored side of what these men lived through, there is a place where history lovers gather for raw footage, unblurred sections, exclusive podcasts, and conversations that go beyond what is usually shared. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The advance did not stop when the caves were cleared. There was still ground to be taken, still defenders who had not yet been found, still the larger purpose that had brought every man to this island in the first place. The airfields behind them were growing busier with each passing day. The possibility that had carried so many across the ocean, that this place could bring the war to Japan's doorstep in a way that might finally force an end, was becoming more real with every position taken. But the men who had gone into the darkness and come out again carried something new into that future fighting. They carried the knowledge that some victories left scars that no amount of ground gained could heal, and that the last breath of an empire could still reach out and change the men who were forced to take it. The island was not finished with them. The final ridges and the last desperate stands were still ahead. But the caves had already done their work. They had shown the men what the end of this particular war would require, and they had left their mark on every heart that had been asked to walk into the dark and come out again on the other side. The war had come for the soldiers first, but it was never going to stop there. On an island this small, with fighting that refused to stay contained to any single line, the children and the mothers who held them became part of the battle whether anyone had planned it or not. In the villages and small settlements scattered across the southern and central parts of the island, life had already begun to fray long before the first shells landed near the homes. Families who had lived under Japanese administration for years, some for generations, had watched the signs gather like storm clouds. Young men were called away to serve. Supplies grew tighter. Official voices on the radio spoke of certain victory and the unbreakable spirit of the empire, yet the eyes of the elders had started to carry a different expression. Mothers sent their children to school when schools were still open, but they kept them closer at home, and conversations that had once been about harvests or festivals now turned quiet whenever the topic of the approaching Americans came up. One mother in a small settlement near the center of the island moved through her days with the same steady hand she had always used to cook and mend and tend the small garden behind her house. She had 2 children, a boy old enough to understand that something was wrong and a younger girl who still asked why the planes flew so low sometimes. The mother had heard the rumors and the official warnings. She had been told that the foreigners who were coming would not distinguish between soldiers and families, that surrender meant shame worse than death. She did not know how much of it was true. She only knew that the world her children had been born into was shrinking with every passing day. She kept extra rice and water in the back room, not because anyone had ordered her to, but because the quiet voice inside her that had once planned for ordinary tomorrows now planned for something darker. When the distant thunder of artillery began to roll across the hills, the mother gathered her children close and tried to make the sound into something ordinary. She told them it was far away, that the soldiers would keep it far away, that they were safe. The boy, who was old enough to hear the difference between far and near, did not argue. He simply stayed closer to his mother's side and stopped asking when his father might come home from wherever he had been sent. The little girl covered her ears when the sound grew louder and asked if they could go to the festival soon. The mother smoothed her hair and said yes, they would go when the soldiers said it was safe again. She did not know if she was lying. She only knew that the lie was the only shield she had left to offer. As the fighting crept closer, families began to move. Some were told by soldiers to leave their homes and head toward the northern part of the island where it was said to be safer. Others left on their own when the shells started landing near the edges of their villages. The movement was not orderly. It was the hurried gathering of what could be carried, a few clothes, a little food, a photograph, or a small bundle of letters, and the long, uncertain walk along roads that were no longer safe. Children who had once run freely between houses now walked in silence, holding their mothers' hands too tightly, their eyes wide at the sight of smoke rising in the distance and the occasional low-flying plane that did not belong to their own side. In one such group moving north, a grandmother walked with her daughter and 2 grandchildren. The grandmother had lived on the island since she was a young woman. She had seen the place change from a quiet outpost to something busier and more military, and now she was watching it become a battlefield. She carried the youngest child on her back when the girl grew tired, and she told stories as they walked, old stories about festivals and ancestors and the way the sea looked on calm mornings. The stories were not meant to explain what was happening. They were meant to give the children something familiar to hold on to while everything else fell away. The daughter walked beside them, her face set in the same expression her own mother had worn during harder times. She did not cry where the children could see. She saved her fear for the moments when she thought no one was watching. The propaganda that had shaped so much of life on the island reached its cruelest point in these days. Families had been told for years that the Americans were monsters who would torture and kill without mercy. Some believed it completely. Others held quiet doubts but could not afford to act on them when the cost of being wrong might be the lives of their children. When the first American patrols began to appear on the edges of the fighting zones, the encounters were often terrifying for everyone involved. A family hiding in a small cluster of trees might see soldiers moving past and freeze, hearts pounding, waiting for the moment when discovery would bring the end they had been warned about. Sometimes the soldiers passed without noticing. Sometimes they stopped, spoke in a language the families did not understand, and moved on after checking that no threat was hidden among the civilians. The gap between what had been feared and what actually happened in those first meetings left some families shaken in new ways. The world they had been prepared for was not the one that was arriving. Yet the fear did not vanish. It simply changed shape. A mother who had been told that surrender meant her children would be harmed now faced the reality that staying in the path of the battle might harm them anyway. Shells did not ask who was a soldier and who was a child. Planes dropped their loads without distinguishing between a military position and a village house. The island that had once felt like a home was becoming a place where safety existed only in the narrow spaces between one danger and the next. Small acts of kindness kept the terror from swallowing everything. In the groups moving north, people who barely knew each other shared what little water they had. A woman who had lost her own child in an earlier shelling helped another mother carry a tired toddler for a stretch of road. An older man who had once been a teacher told stories to a cluster of frightened children while their parents tried to find a path that avoided the worst of the fighting. These were not heroic gestures meant for history. They were the ordinary ways people reminded themselves that they were still human, still connected, still capable of care even when the world had turned against them. The children carried their own versions of the fear. A boy who had been proud of his schoolwork now walked with his head down, no longer asking questions about when life would return to normal. A girl who had loved to play near the water's edge now flinched at every loud sound and clung to her mother's skirt as if letting go would mean being lost forever. They did not understand the larger reasons why this island had become important, why the airfields that were being fought over mattered to distant leaders on both sides, or why the outcome here might bring the war closer to a place called Japan that some of them had never seen. They understood only that the adults around them were afraid, that the sounds in the distance were getting closer, and that the places they had once called safe no longer felt that way. As the battle lines shifted and the fighting reached deeper into the areas where families had tried to find shelter, the moments of direct encounter grew more heartbreaking. Some families were caught between advancing American forces and retreating Japanese units. Others found themselves in villages that became sudden battlegrounds when defenders chose to make a stand among the houses. The sounds of close fighting, the sharp crack of rifles, the heavier thump of mortars, the shouts that might have been orders or might have been pain, reached children who had been told only that they must stay quiet and hidden. When the firing stopped, the silence that followed was sometimes worse than the noise, because it left room for the imagination to fill in what had happened to the people who had not come back. In one such village that had been touched by the fighting, a mother and her 2 children emerged from the small shelter they had dug behind their house. The house itself was damaged, the roof partly gone, the garden trampled. The mother checked her children first, her hands moving over them as if to make sure they were still whole. The boy had a cut on his arm from flying debris. The girl was crying softly but without sound, the way children learn to cry when they understand that noise can bring danger. The mother cleaned the cut with water from a broken jug and tore a strip from her own clothing to wrap it. She did not have medicine. She had only the instinct to do what she could with what remained. As she worked, she spoke to the children in the same steady voice she had used when the distant thunder first began. She told them they were brave. She told them they would find a safer place soon. She did not tell them that she did not know where that place was or whether it existed. The educational weight of these days lived in the way ordinary families experienced a war that had been designed and decided far from their homes. They did not see the maps or the strategic calculations that had made this island the key to bringing bombers within reach of Japan itself. They did not know the larger arithmetic that had turned their villages and fields into part of a campaign that might shorten the war or lengthen it depending on who held the ground. What they knew was that the fighting had arrived at their doorsteps, that their children were now as much at risk as any soldier, and that the world they had been taught to believe in, the one where the empire protected its people and victory was certain, was cracking under the weight of reality. The propaganda that had shaped their fears had also shaped their choices. It had made surrender feel impossible even when staying meant walking further into the storm. That tragic power did not belong only to the leaders who had created it. It belonged to every family that had to live inside its consequences. The resilience that appeared in these moments was real and heartbreaking at the same time. Families who had lost everything still found ways to comfort one another. Children who had seen things no child should see still reached for their mother's hands and tried to be brave. Mothers who had every reason to break kept moving, kept speaking in steady voices, kept offering the small shields of story and touch and presence that were all they had left to give. These were not the stories that made official reports or victory announcements. They were the quiet, human truths that lived in the spaces between the battles, the truths that revealed what total war actually cost when it finally reached the people who had never chosen it. These are the kinds of deeply personal, often overlooked stories that reveal the true human cost of conflict in ways that go far beyond the battlefield reports. The hidden struggles of families and children caught in the crossfire, the quiet acts of courage that never make the headlines, and the forgotten chapters that shaped the war's emotional and moral landscape. If the heartbreaking reality of how the war reached the innocent on this island has stayed with you, and you want to explore more of these hidden human stories along with the secret operations and overlooked heroes that influenced the larger conflict, there is a free email newsletter that delivers an exclusive ebook called The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives into espionage, forgotten heroes, and the hidden stories behind the battles we think we already know. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the fighting continued to push northward and the spaces where families could still find even the illusion of safety grew smaller, the children of the island carried their experiences into whatever future remained. Some would remember the sound of their mothers' voices trying to turn terror into something ordinary. Some would remember the moment when the world they had known simply stopped existing. All of them would carry, in ways they could not yet understand, the knowledge that war does not stop at the edge of the battlefield and that the price of bringing a conflict to an enemy's doorstep can be paid by people who never held a weapon or chose a side. The island was not finished with its suffering. There were still ridges to be taken and desperate stands to be made. But the war had already done something irreversible to the families who had tried to survive inside it. It had taken their ordinary days and replaced them with a new kind of memory, one that would stay long after the last shell fell and the last soldier moved on, one that would shape the way they saw safety and fear and the fragile, stubborn thing called hope for the rest of their lives. The final desperate rush came not as a calculated military maneuver but as something older and more terrible, the last human wave of an empire that could no longer retreat and would not surrender. In the northern hills and ridges where the remaining Japanese forces had been driven, the situation had grown hopeless in ways that maps and reports could never fully capture. Supplies were nearly gone. Wounded men lay in makeshift aid stations with little medicine and less hope. The airfields that had once promised a chance to strike back were now in enemy hands, and word had spread among the defenders that bombers from those same fields would soon be able to reach the home islands themselves. For the soldiers still able to fight, the choice had narrowed to two paths: continue a resistance that could no longer change the outcome of the larger war, or accept the final, terrible option that their training and culture had prepared them to embrace. In the quiet hours before the attack was ordered, men wrote last letters they knew would never reach their families, shared what little food remained, and spoke in low voices about duty, honor, and the shame of living when their comrades had already fallen. These were not abstract ideas. They were the private thoughts of young men who had been told since boyhood that to die for the emperor was the highest purpose a life could serve, and that surrender was a fate worse than any death. One such soldier, a young man who had arrived on the island months earlier full of the certainty that victory was inevitable, sat with his back against the earthen wall of a shallow position and tried to steady his breathing. He had already been wounded once in the fighting near the center of the island. The bandage on his leg was dirty and the pain had become a constant companion, but he had refused to be left behind when the order came to withdraw northward. Around him, other men checked their rifles, fixed bayonets, and prepared in the way soldiers prepare when they know the next action will likely be their last. Some spoke of home in voices that tried to sound brave. Others remained silent, their eyes fixed on the ground or on the dark shapes of the hills ahead. The young soldier thought of his mother and the small garden she tended behind their house. He thought of the letters he had sent and the ones he had received, full of ordinary news that now felt impossibly distant. He did not write another letter. There was no time and no paper left that mattered. Instead, he checked his weapon one final time and waited for the signal that would send them forward into the darkness or the dawn, depending on when the order came. On the American side of the line, the men who held the forward positions had no way of knowing the full scale of what was about to come. They had fought through the beach, the nights of infiltration, the push toward the airfields, and the brutal cave clearing that had followed. Many were exhausted, their nerves worn thin by weeks of constant alertness. In the shallow foxholes and behind the low ridges that marked the current front, soldiers tried to rest when they could, sharing cigarettes and quiet conversation when the immediate danger allowed it. One Marine who had already seen too many friends fall sat with his squad leader and spoke in a low voice about what might come next. They had heard rumors that the enemy was cornered and desperate. They had seen the signs of collapsing resistance in some areas and the fierce, last-stand fighting in others. Neither man said the word banzai out loud, but both carried the knowledge that something final and terrible might still be ahead. The squad leader, a man who had learned to read the small signs of fear in his men, offered a quiet word of reassurance that was more about presence than about any promise he could actually keep. In the dark, that presence mattered more than strategy. When the attack finally came, it arrived with a suddenness that turned the night or the early morning into a single, unbroken roar of sound and motion. Thousands of Japanese soldiers rose from their positions and surged forward in a human wave that seemed to have no end. Some ran with rifles and bayonets, others with swords or even bare hands. Wounded men who could still walk or crawl joined the rush, determined not to be left behind. The sound that reached the American lines was not the disciplined fire of a coordinated assault, but the collective cry of men who had accepted that this was the end. It was a sound that mixed rage and despair and a terrible kind of courage, the courage of those who had decided that dying in the attack was preferable to any other fate. The young Japanese soldier who had thought of his mother's garden found himself running with the others, his wounded leg screaming with every step. Around him men fell to American fire, yet the wave kept moving because stopping meant something worse than death. He fired his rifle until it was empty, then continued forward because the momentum of the charge and the presence of his comrades carried him along. In those moments there was no room for grand thoughts or private reflection. There was only the ground. Beneath his feet, the sound of his own breathing, and the distant shapes of the American positions growing closer with every stride. When a burst of fire caught him in the chest, he felt a strange sense of relief mixed with the pain. He had done what was asked of him. He had not surrendered. As he fell, the world narrowed to the sky above and the sound of his comrades still rushing forward, their voices carrying the last defiant cry of an empire that could no longer win but would not accept defeat. On the American side, the first moments of the charge were pure chaos and terror. Men who had been resting or standing watch suddenly found themselves facing a wall of humanity that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The foxholes and shallow positions that had felt secure moments earlier now felt impossibly fragile. Rifle fire and machine guns opened up along the line, but the wave kept coming because there were simply too many attackers and too much momentum behind them. One young Marine in a forward position felt his heart hammering as he fired into the mass of men rushing toward him. He had trained for this, prepared for this, yet nothing had prepared him for the sight of wounded soldiers still advancing, of men who seemed to have no fear of death because they had already chosen it. He saw comrades fall beside him and kept firing because stopping meant the line would break and the wave would roll over everything behind it. In the middle of that horror, small acts of courage and humanity still appeared. A squad leader who had been wounded earlier in the campaign stood in his hole and directed fire even as the attackers reached the edge of his position. When one of his men was hit and began to slide down into the bottom of the foxhole, the squad leader pulled him back up and kept him firing, his voice steady in a way that gave the others something to hold onto. Nearby, another Marine who had run out of ammunition grabbed a fallen comrade's rifle and continued the fight, not because he expected to survive but because the man beside him was still alive and still needed covering fire. These were not grand gestures of heroism meant for medals or citations. They were the instinctive responses of men who had learned that survival in moments like this depended on refusing to let the person next to you face the wave alone. The Japanese attackers who reached the American lines fought with a ferocity born of desperation and conviction. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in places where the wave crashed through the forward positions. Men grappled in the dirt, using bayonets, rifle butts, and bare hands. Some of the attackers, already wounded or exhausted, seemed almost relieved when the end came. Others fought on with a stubborn refusal to yield even when the charge had clearly failed. The young Japanese soldier who had fallen earlier was not alone in his final moments. Around him, others continued the rush until American fire or the sheer exhaustion of the attack brought them down. Those who survived the initial wave and found themselves behind American lines sometimes continued fighting in small groups or alone, refusing to surrender even when capture was the only alternative to death. For the Americans who held the line through the worst of the charge, the aftermath brought a complex mixture of emotions that no training had prepared them to name. There was relief that the wave had broken and the immediate threat had passed. There was grief for the friends who had fallen in the chaos. And there was something else, a strange, unsettling pity for the men who had chosen this end, who had run forward knowing they would almost certainly die. One Marine who had survived the hand-to-hand fighting sat afterward with his back against the wall of his foxhole and stared at the ground in front of him. He had killed men that morning, some at close range, some who had already been wounded before the charge began. He did not feel triumphant. He felt tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, and he wondered, in the quiet that followed the noise, whether there had been another way for those men to meet their end. He did not speak these thoughts aloud. He simply sat with them while the line was reorganized and the wounded were carried back and the dead were counted. The charge had been the last great organized effort of the Japanese forces on the island. In its failure, the remaining defenders were left scattered and broken, with no realistic hope of changing the outcome of the battle. For the Americans, the human wave had been a terrifying reminder of how far an enemy could be pushed before the only remaining choice was one final, terrible rush toward death. The cost had been high on both sides. American casualties from the charge were significant, and the psychological impact on the survivors would stay with many of them long after the island was secured. Japanese losses were catastrophic, turning what had been a fighting force into scattered groups of men who would continue to resist in smaller, more desperate ways until the very end. In the days that followed, as the American lines pushed forward again and the remaining pockets of resistance were cleared, the men who had lived through the human wave carried its memory into every new position they took. They had seen what happened when an army chose death over defeat, and they had been forced to be the instrument of that choice. Some found a grim kind of respect for the courage it had taken to run forward into certain death. Others felt only horror at the waste of so many young lives. All of them understood, in ways they had not fully understood before, that the war they were fighting had reached a stage where the old rules of victory and defeat no longer applied in any ordinary sense. This was no longer about gaining ground or capturing objectives that could still change the larger conflict. This was about ending a resistance that had chosen to end in blood rather than in surrender. The stories of that final human wave, the young Japanese soldier who thought of his mother's garden as he ran forward, the American Marine who kept firing even when his friends fell beside him, the small acts of courage that appeared in the middle of the chaos, deserve to be remembered not only in words but in the images and artifacts that bring the Pacific Theater and its human cost to life. If the courage, the tragedy, and the unbreakable spirit shown by men on both sides in those terrible hours have moved you, there are powerful ways to keep that connection alive. Authentic World War II memorabilia from the Pacific campaigns and the film Midway on Prime Video offer a chance to see and feel the stakes and the sacrifice in a way that honors everything these men endured. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The island was not yet finished with its suffering. There were still ridges to be taken and final stands to be made in the northernmost reaches. But the human wave that had chosen death over defeat had broken the last organized resistance that could have changed the outcome. What remained was the slow, painful clearing of the last pockets and the heartbreaking final chapter that would unfold at the cliffs where so many would make their last choice. The men who had survived the charge on both sides carried its weight forward, the Japanese in their scattered, desperate resistance, the Americans in the quiet knowledge that they had faced and broken something that went beyond ordinary battle. The war had come to this island to bring it closer to Japan's doorstep, and in the human wave that chose death, that purpose had been paid for in ways that no one who lived through it would ever fully forget. The advance continued because it had to continue, but every man who moved forward now did so with the memory of that wave still echoing in the spaces between one ridge and the next. In the northern reaches of the island, the space left for the defenders grew smaller with every passing day, until the men who remained could feel the walls of their world closing in around them. They had been pushed steadily northward since the first landings, through the fields and the ridges and the caves that had already claimed so many. What had once been a fighting force capable of contesting the entire island was now a collection of scattered groups, wounded men, and exhausted survivors clinging to the last high ground. The airfields behind the American lines were already being used. The possibility that had brought the invasion to this place in the first place, that bombers could finally reach Japan itself from these captured runways, was becoming real with every mile the defenders lost. For the Japanese soldiers still holding positions in the north, that knowledge arrived not as strategy but as a growing, suffocating certainty. The war they had been told they would win had reached their own doorstep in the form of an enemy that would not stop advancing, and the only ground left to them was shrinking toward the sea. A young Japanese soldier who had survived the earlier fighting and the human wave that had broken against the American lines sat in a shallow position overlooking a narrow valley. He had been wounded in the leg during the charge and had been carried north by comrades who refused to leave him behind. Now he could walk with difficulty, but every step reminded him that his body was failing in the same way his army was failing. Around him, other men went about the small tasks of survival, checking weapons that had little ammunition left, sharing what remained of their rations, speaking in low voices about the families they would never see again. The young soldier had tried to write a letter the night before, but the words would not come. What could he say that would make sense to his mother or his younger brother when the truth was that he had already accepted he would not be coming home? He folded the blank paper and tucked it into his pocket anyway, as if the act of carrying something meant for them might still connect him to the life he had left behind. The loneliness of these final days was unlike anything most of the men had experienced earlier in the battle. In the south and the center, there had been the noise of constant fighting, the presence of large units, the illusion that the larger war might still turn. Here in the north, the sounds of battle came from farther away, and the groups that remained were smaller, more isolated. Men who had once been part of companies now fought in squads or even alone. The sense of being part of something larger had given way to the simpler, heavier knowledge that each day brought them closer to the edge of the island and the end of any meaningful resistance. Some found a strange kind of peace in that knowledge. Others carried only the weight of unfinished lives and the private fear that their deaths would mean nothing beyond another name on a list that would never reach home. On the American side, the advance into the northern hills was conducted with a different kind of tension. The men who pushed forward knew they were closing the last chapter of organized resistance on the island. They moved carefully, aware that desperate defenders in shrinking terrain could still inflict terrible losses. One Marine who had fought through the entire campaign from the first wave on the beach walked with his squad through a stretch of broken ground and found himself thinking about what came after this. The airfields were secure. The bombers would soon be flying missions toward Japan. The war that had seemed endless when they first crossed the ocean now felt as though it might actually be approaching some kind of conclusion. He did not say this out loud. The men around him were still focused on the immediate task of clearing the next ridge and the next draw, and speaking of endings felt like tempting fate. But the thought stayed with him as they moved, a quiet thread of hope mixed with the exhaustion that had settled into his bones over weeks of fighting. The Japanese defenders who remained in the north did not have the luxury of thinking about what might come after. Their world had narrowed to the immediate reality of holding the last positions, caring for the wounded who could not be evaluated, and preparing for the inevitable moment when the Americans would reach them. In one small group clustered around a rocky outcrop, an older soldier who had fought in earlier campaigns took it upon himself to speak quietly to the younger men. He did not offer false hope or grand speeches about victory. Instead, he spoke of duty in the simplest terms, that they had been given a task and that they would see it through together. He shared what little water he had with a wounded man who could no longer walk, and he made sure the youngest soldier in the group had a place to rest where he would not be exposed to the sporadic American artillery that still reached into their area. These small acts of care did not change the larger situation. They simply reminded the men that even as their world collapsed, they were not entirely alone. The educational weight of these final days lived in the way the shrinking space forced every man to confront the reality of what the island had always represented. The capture of Saipan had never been only about taking ground. It had been about placing American air power within range of Japan itself, about bringing the war to the enemy's doorstep in a way that previous island victories had not achieved. For the defenders who had been ordered to hold this place at all costs, that strategic truth arrived as a personal sentence. They could not retreat further. They could not be resupplied. They could not change the fact that the airfields behind the American lines were already preparing to launch the bombers that would carry the war into Japanese cities. The noose that was tightening around them was not only military. It was the closing of any remaining possibility that this battle could still be turned into something other than defeat. As the American forces continued their methodical advance, small encounters revealed the human cost of that closing. A patrol moving through a narrow draw might find a handful of Japanese soldiers who chose to fight rather than withdraw, or who could no longer withdraw because their wounds or their exhaustion had left them with nowhere to go. The fighting in these moments was close and final. There was little room for the kind of maneuvering that had characterized earlier phases of the battle. Men died because they had been ordered to hold ground that could no longer be held, or because they had decided that dying in place was preferable to any other option left to them. The Americans who cleared these positions did so with a growing understanding that the resistance they faced now was not about winning but about choosing how to end. In the quiet moments between these encounters, the Japanese soldiers who remained wrote what they could or spoke what they needed to say to the men beside them. One young soldier who had been separated from his unit during the earlier fighting found himself with a small group that included men he had never met before the withdrawal north. They shared what food they had and took turns keeping watch through the night. In the darkness, one of the older men spoke quietly about his family and about the life he had expected to return to after the war. He did not pretend that return was still possible. He simply spoke the words as a way of keeping some part of himself alive a little longer. The young soldier listened and found himself thinking of his own family in the same way, not with hope of reunion, but with the simple human need to remember who he had been before the island had claimed him. The Americans pushing into the same terrain carried their own reflections. A squad leader who had already lost too many men in the campaign moved his remaining soldiers with extra care, aware that the desperate defenders ahead might still have the means to inflict one final, costly blow. He had seen the airfields being prepared behind the lines. He understood what the capture of this northern ground would mean for the larger war. Yet he also understood that every yard gained here was being paid for by men who were as tired and as human as the defenders they faced. In the brief lulls, he checked on his soldiers, made sure the wounded were as comfortable as the situation allowed, and spoke in the steady voice that had become his way of holding his squad together through everything they had already endured. These small acts of leadership did not change the fact that the noose was tightening for everyone involved. They simply reminded the men that even in the final phase of the battle, they were not fighting alone. The growing despair among the Japanese defenders did not always show itself in dramatic ways. It appeared in the quiet acceptance of men who stopped trying to find ways to escape or to hold out longer. It appeared in the way some soldiers began to speak openly about what would happen when the Americans finally reached their positions. It appeared in the small rituals of preparing for an end that could no longer be avoided, the careful folding of a photograph, the sharing of a final cigarette, the quiet decision to stay with a wounded comrade rather than leave him behind. These were not acts of defeat in the way defeat is usually understood. They were acts of men who had run out of alternatives and who were choosing to meet the end with whatever dignity and connection they could still preserve. As the American lines continued to compress the remaining resistance into an ever smaller area, the sense of inevitability became almost physical. The northern tip of the island offered no room for maneuver, no path of withdrawal, and no realistic hope that help would arrive in time to change anything. The men who remained knew this. They had known it for days. What they did with that knowledge varied from man to man and from moment to moment. Some chose to fight on in small, isolated actions. Others prepared for the final confrontation that would come when the noose finally closed completely. All of them carried the weight of having been part of a battle that had brought the war to this place and that would, in its outcome, bring the war even closer to the home islands they had been told they were defending. The noose that was tightening around the northern defenders was also, in a larger sense, tightening around the possibility that Japan could continue the war on its own terms. The airfields that were now secure behind American lines would soon be launching bombers that could reach Japanese cities directly. The island that had been chosen because of its position relative to Japan was fulfilling that purpose with every day that the defenders lost ground. For the men still holding out in the shrinking perimeter, that strategic truth arrived as a personal reality. They were not only fighting for their own survival or for the honor of their unit. They were living through the final days of a defense that had always been about delaying something larger, the moment when the war would arrive at Japan's own doorstep in a way that could no longer be ignored or wished away. In the quiet hours before the final confrontations that would come in the northernmost reaches, the men on both sides carried their private thoughts into the darkness. The Japanese soldiers who remained wrote what they could or spoke what they needed to say. The American soldiers who advanced did so with the knowledge that the end of organized resistance on this island was close, and that what came after would be shaped by the airfields they had already secured. The human cost of that closing, the loneliness of men facing the end with only their comrades beside them, the quiet despair of those who had run out of alternatives, the small acts of care that persisted even as the world narrowed, was the true measure of what it had taken to bring the war to this place. The noose was tightening. The final chapter was approaching. And the men who would live through it would carry the memory of these last days long after the island itself had been secured and the bombers had begun their flights toward the horizon that had once seemed so far away. These final days in the north, with their quiet desperation, the unfiltered human cost of facing the inevitable, and the raw realities of men confronting the end of their world, are part of the story that official accounts often leave in shadow. The unseen moments, the last letters never sent, the small kindnesses shared in the face of collapse, the profound loneliness that no map or report could capture, deserve to be remembered in their full, unflinching truth. If the human weight of this tightening noose has stayed with you and you want to see the harsher, uncensored side of what these men endured, there is a digital collection available that gathers raw images and footage too difficult or too restricted to show in ordinary channels. It offers an unflinching look at the realities that shaped these battles and the soldiers who lived through them. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The advance continued because it had to continue. The noose continued to tighten because there was no longer any room left for it to do anything else. And the men who remained on both sides of the shrinking line carried forward the knowledge that the final chapter of this battle would be written not in grand maneuvers or decisive victories, but in the small, human spaces where soldiers faced the end of their world with whatever courage and connection they had left. The northern tip of the island waited. The last ridges and the final choices were still ahead. But the noose had already done its work. It had brought every man who remained to the edge of what they could endure, and it had left them with only one direction left to go. At the northern edge of the island, where the land ended in sheer drops to the sea, the last choices of a battle were made not with rifles but with the terrible courage of those who leapt into the void rather than face what they had been told awaited them in surrender. The noose that had been tightening for weeks finally closed around the northernmost tip of the island. What remained of the Japanese forces, along with hundreds of civilians who had been swept along in the retreat, found themselves with nowhere left to go. The cliffs at Marpy Point rose above the water like the final wall of a world that had already collapsed. Behind them lay the ridges and caves that had already been fought over and cleared. Ahead lay only the sea and the rocks below. For the men and women gathered there, the choice had been reduced to something almost unbearable in its simplicity: step forward into the arms of the enemy they had been taught to fear above all else, or step off the edge into whatever came after. A mother who had walked for days with her two small children found herself at the edge of one of the cliffs with a group of other families. She had tried to keep the children fed and as safe as she could during the long retreat from the southern villages. She had told them stories when the sounds of fighting grew close, and she had held them through the nights when sleep would not come. Now, standing on the narrow strip of ground between the last Japanese positions and the drop to the water, she felt the weight of every mile they had traveled and every fear she had tried to hide from them. The little girl clung to her skirt and asked why they could not go home. The boy, older and quieter, simply held her hand and looked at the sea as if he already understood that home was no longer a place they could reach. The mother had heard the same warnings the soldiers had heard, that the Americans would do terrible things to anyone who surrendered, that capture meant dishonor and suffering worse than death. She did not know how much of it was true. She only knew that the world had narrowed to this cliff and that she could not see a way forward that did not end in the loss of everything she had tried to protect. Nearby, a young Japanese soldier who had survived the earlier fighting and the desperate charges sat with a small group of comrades. He had been wounded in the leg during one of the last organized attacks and had been helped north by men who would not leave him behind. Now he could barely walk, and the pain had become a constant presence that made every thought slower and heavier. Around him, other soldiers spoke in low voices about what they should do. Some argued that they should make one final stand, that dying with their weapons in their hands was the only honorable choice left. Others sat in silence, their eyes on the edge of the cliff or on the faces of the civilians who had gathered nearby. The young soldier thought of his family far away and of the letters he had never finished writing. He had been raised to believe that surrender was the greatest shame a man could bring upon himself and his name. Yet in this moment, with the sea stretching out below and the sound of American voices calling for them to come down, the old certainties felt less certain than they once had. He did not know what he would choose when the moment came. He only knew that the choice was no longer his alone. From the American positions below and on the ridges facing the cliffs, soldiers watched the gathering at the edge with a mixture of horror and a strange, aching pity. They had been ordered to offer surrender whenever possible, to call out to the Japanese that they would be treated fairly if they laid down their arms. Some of the Americans tried. They shouted through megaphones or simply raised their voices across the narrowing space, promising safety and medical care for the wounded. A few Japanese soldiers did come down, their faces blank with exhaustion and something deeper than fatigue. But most stayed where they were, and the Americans could only watch as the tragedy unfolded in front of them. One Marine who had fought through the entire campaign from the first day on the beach stood with his squad and felt something inside him shift as he saw a mother at the cliff's edge gather her children close. He had hated the enemy for what they had done to his friends. He had fought them with everything he had. But this moment of families choosing the sea over the possibility of capture, was something else entirely. It was not the war he had trained for. It was something older and more terrible, and it left him with a sorrow he could not name. The indoctrination that had shaped so much of the Japanese military and civilian response on this island reached its most devastating expression at these cliffs. For years, soldiers and civilians alike had been told that the Americans were monsters who would torture, rape, and kill without mercy. They had been taught that death in battle or by their own hand was preferable to the shame of surrender. That teaching had carried men through the beach defenses and the cave fighting and the final desperate charges. Now, at the edge of the island, it carried families and soldiers alike to the final choice. Some leapt alone, their bodies falling into the water or onto the rocks below. Others went in groups, holding hands or carrying children, as if the act of dying together might make the act itself less final. The sounds that reached the Americans below were not the sounds of battle. They were the sounds of voices calling out names, of children crying, of the sea receiving what the land could no longer hold. In the middle of that collective tragedy, small moments of human connection still appeared. A soldier helped a wounded comrade to the edge rather than leave him to face the Americans alone. A mother comforted a child who was too young to understand what was happening, stroking her hair and speaking in the same steady voice she had used when the distant thunder first began weeks earlier. An older man who had lived on the island for many years placed a hand on the shoulder of a young soldier and spoke quietly about duty and about the families they were leaving behind. These were not acts of defiance or of glory. They were the last, stubborn expressions of humanity in a place where humanity itself seemed to have run out of room. The Americans who witnessed these moments from below felt the weight of them in ways that no training film or briefing could have prepared them for. They had come to this island to take it, to secure the airfields, to bring the war closer to Japan. They had not come to watch mothers and children choose death rather than face them. The educational truth of these final hours lived in the way the cliffs revealed what the entire battle had been moving toward. The capture of Saipan had always been about more than one island. It had been about placing American bombers within range of Japanese cities, about forcing the enemy to confront the reality that the war had reached their own shores in a way that could no longer be denied or delayed. The defenders who had been ordered to hold this place at all costs had done so with a determination that had already cost thousands of lives. Now, at the cliffs, that determination reached its most heartbreaking conclusion. The men and women who leapt did so not because they wanted to die, but because they had been given no acceptable alternative. The propaganda that had shaped their fears and their choices had done its work completely. It had turned surrender into something worse than the rocks and the sea below. For the Americans who secured the area in the days that followed, the sight of the cliffs and the bodies below became a memory that would stay with many of them for the rest of their lives. Some felt only horror at the waste. Others felt a complicated mixture of relief that the fighting was finally ending and a sorrow that it had ended this way. They gathered what they could, helped the few who had chosen to come down, and tried to make sense of what they had seen. One young Marine who had shouted himself hoarse calling for surrender sat afterward with his head in his hands and wondered aloud to no one in particular whether there had been another way. His squad leader, a man who had already seen too much on this island, had no answer. He simply placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder and said that they had done what they could. The words were true, but they did not ease the weight of what remained. The sorrow that settled over the cliffs was not only for the lives lost in the final moments. It was for everything that had led to those moments, the years of indoctrination, the culture of honor that had left no room for surrender, the strategic reality that had turned this small island into the place where the war's next phase would be decided. The airfields behind the American lines were already operational. The bombers that would carry the conflict to Japan itself were already being prepared. The battle for Saipan had achieved what it had been meant to achieve. But the cost of that achievement had been paid in ways that no one who planned the campaign could have fully imagined when the first ships crossed the ocean. The cliffs had become the place where the human price of bringing the war to Japan's doorstep was written in the most final and heartbreaking language possible. These are the kinds of deeply human and often overlooked stories that reveal the true emotional and moral cost of war, the final, tragic choices made at the edge of the world, the quiet acts of connection that persisted even in the face of the unthinkable, and the profound sorrow that lingered long after the battle itself had ended. Keeping these forgotten chapters alive, so that we might understand not only what happened but how it felt to those who lived through it, requires real dedication, careful research, and a genuine commitment to remembering the full weight of history. If the heartbreaking reality of the cliffs and the lives that ended there has stayed with you, and you want to help support the work of bringing more of these essential human stories to light, you can leave a small tip on Ko-Fi, even as little as $1. It goes directly towards sustaining the research and the care it takes to tell these stories with the honesty they deserve. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the days and weeks that followed the fall of the cliffs, the island grew quieter. The last pockets of resistance were cleared. The airfields hummed with activity as bombers prepared for the missions that would carry the war deeper into Japanese territory. The men who had fought through every phase of the battle, from the first terrifying moments on the beach to the final, haunting images at the northern edge, carried what they had seen into whatever came next. Some would speak of it. Most would not. The sorrow of the cliffs was not something that could be easily put into words, and many chose to carry it in silence. But the memory remained, a quiet presence that shaped how they understood the war they had fought and the peace they hoped would follow. The island that had been chosen because it could bring the conflict to Japan's doorstep had done exactly that. It had also shown, in the most devastating way possible, what that bringing would cost when an enemy had been taught that there was no acceptable way to lose. The cliffs stood as both ending and beginning, the end of organized resistance on Saipan, and the beginning of a new phase of the war in which the human cost would only grow heavier. The men who had stood at the edge and watched, and the men and women who had made the final choice, had written the last chapter of this particular battle in a language that no one who lived through it would ever fully forget. When the last organized resistance finally fell silent, the island did not celebrate. It simply exhaled, leaving the men who had taken it to sit with the weight of everything that silence now contained. The fighting had ended not with a single dramatic moment but with a gradual fading, the last scattered shots from isolated pockets, the final small groups of defenders who could no longer sustain any meaningful resistance. For the American forces that had fought their way across the beaches, through the nights of infiltration, the push to the airfields, the brutal cave clearing, the desperate human wave, and the heartbreaking final stands at the northern cliffs, the sudden absence of gunfire felt almost unreal. Men who had lived for weeks with the constant tension of possible attack found themselves checking their weapons out of habit, listening for sounds that no longer came. The quiet was not peaceful. It was heavy, filled with the echoes of everything that had been lost and everything that had been gained at such terrible cost. In the days that followed the official end of major combat, the men who remained began the slow, exhausting work of securing what they had fought for and coming to terms with what it had taken. The airfields that had been the true prize were already being expanded and prepared. Engineers moved in with equipment that had been waiting offshore, turning contested strips of ground into operational runways from which bombers would soon be able to reach Japan itself. Supply ships that had been held back during the worst of the fighting now approached the beaches that had once been killing grounds. The machinery of victory began to turn, but the men who had made that victory possible moved through their tasks with a different kind of energy, not the sharp alertness of combat, but the dull, bone-deep fatigue of those who had given everything they had and were only beginning to understand how much that everything had cost. One Marine who had landed on the first day and had somehow survived every phase of the battle sat on an ammunition crate near what had once been the edge of the forward line and tried to write a letter home. He had written many letters during the campaign, short, careful notes that said little about the reality of what he was living through. This one was different. He found himself wanting to explain something he could not yet fully name. He wrote about the friends who were not coming home, about the way the island had changed from a place of terrifying noise to a place of unsettling quiet, about the strange feeling of walking across ground that had once been fought over yard by yard and now belonged to them without argument. He did not write about the cliffs. He was not ready to put those images into words that might reach his family. Instead, he wrote that he was safe, that the worst was over, and that he hoped to be home sooner than he had once believed possible. The words felt both true and incomplete. He folded the letter and put it away, knowing he might never send it, knowing also that the act of trying to write it had been necessary in a way he could not explain. Nearby, a small group of soldiers who had fought together through the cave clearing and the final northern push sat in the shade of a damaged tree and shared what remained of a ration tin. They did not speak much at first. The exhaustion was too deep for easy conversation. But after a while, one of them began to talk about a friend who had been killed during the human wave, not with dramatic stories of heroism, but with the quiet details that only those who had known the man would understand. He spoke about the way his friend had always shared his cigarettes even when supplies were low, about the small jokes he had told to ease tension before a patrol, about the letter from home he had been carrying when he died. The others listened without interrupting. They had their own versions of the same story, different names, different small kindnesses, the same underlying truth that the men they had lost had been more than the sum of their deaths. In the sharing of these ordinary memories, something like grace appeared. It did not erase the grief or the exhaustion, but it reminded them that they were still connected to one another and to the ones who were no longer there. The cost of the victory was visible everywhere once the immediate danger had passed. Makeshift cemeteries appeared on the edges of the former battlefields, rows of simple markers that would later be replaced by more formal arrangements, but that for now stood as the only acknowledgement of the lives that had ended here. Men who had been too busy surviving to fully register their losses now found time to visit these places, to stand for a moment beside the name of a friend or a squad mate, to say the things they had not been able to say when the fighting was still happening. Some wrote letters to families they had never met, trying to put into words what their loved ones had meant to the men who had fought beside them. Others simply stood in silence, letting the quiet do the work that words could not. These were not grand gestures of mourning. They were the small, necessary acts of men who were beginning to understand that winning this island had changed them in ways that would last long after they left its shores. The educational weight of these quiet days lived in the way the men who had taken the island began to grasp what their victory actually meant. They had secured the airfields. The bombers that would soon take off from those runways would carry the war directly to Japanese cities in a way that previous campaigns had not achieved. The strategic purpose that had justified the terrible cost was being fulfilled with every day that passed. Yet the men on the ground did not experience this as abstract strategy. They experienced it as the knowledge that their friends had died so that this place could become a launching point for further destruction, so that the war could be brought closer to an end that might still require even greater sacrifices. Some found a grim satisfaction in that knowledge, the sense that the price they had paid might actually shorten the larger conflict and spare others the same journey. Others carried only the weight of what had been lost, without any clear sense that the gain justified it. Both responses were true. Both lived in the same exhausted men as they moved through the work of securing what they had won. Small moments of grace continued to appear amid the devastation. A medic who had worked without rest through the final days of fighting took time to check on soldiers who had minor wounds that had gone untreated in the chaos. He moved from position to position with the same steady presence that had kept men alive during the worst of the combat, offering what little comfort he could now that the immediate danger had passed. A squad leader who had lost half his men in the northern push made sure the survivors were fed and rested before assigning them to any new tasks, understanding that the body could recover faster than the spirit and that both needed care. These were not dramatic acts of heroism. They were the ordinary ways men who had been through hell together continued to look after one another when the hell was finally over. In their quiet persistence, they spoke volumes about what had held the line through everything that had come before. As the days passed and the island settled into its new reality, the men who had fought for it began to understand something that went beyond the immediate victory. They had changed. The young Marine who had landed full of certainty and fear was not the same person who now sat writing letters he might never send. The squad leader who had carried his men through cave after cave and ridge after ridge now carried something else, the knowledge that survival had come at a cost he could not yet measure. The medic who had saved lives under fire now understood that some wounds could not be bandaged or treated with medicine. These changes were not visible to anyone who had not lived through the battle. They showed themselves in small ways, in the way a man paused before speaking, in the way another stared at the horizon for longer than necessary, in the way a group that had once joked easily now sometimes sat in companionable silence. The island had been won. The airfields were operational. The larger war was moving forward. But the men who had made those things possible were carrying the victory inside them in ways that would shape everything that came after. The quiet that had settled over the island was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of exhaustion and reckoning, of men who had given everything they had to take a place that would now be used to carry the war even further from home. They had done what had been asked of them. They had held the line through nights of steel and shadow, through human waves and cave fighting and the heartbreaking final choices at the cliffs. They had secured the ground that would allow bombers to reach Japan. And in the doing of it, they had been changed in ways that no one who had not stood where they stood could fully understand. The victory spoke in the silence they now carried, in the letters written and not sent, in the small kindnesses that persisted amid devastation, in the quiet understanding that winning this island had cost something that could never be fully repaid or forgotten. These quiet moments of reckoning, the unfiltered emotional cost that so many carried home in silence, the small acts of grace that revealed what true resilience looked like after the fighting ended, and the deeper transformations that victory demanded of those who survived it, are part of the story that deserves to be explored without filters or softening. If the human weight of what these men endured and the quiet aftermath that shaped them has stayed with you, and you want to go deeper into the uncensored realities and the stories that matter most, there is a place where history lovers gather for raw footage, unblurred sections, exclusive podcasts, and conversations that explore the full truth of what these battles cost. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the weeks that followed, as more units arrived to take over the work of holding and developing the island, the men who had fought through the battle began to prepare for whatever came next. Some would be sent to other campaigns. Some would eventually return home. All of them would carry the memory of this place, the beaches where so many had fallen, the caves that had tested every limit, the cliffs where hope had leapt to its end, and the quiet days afterward when the true cost of victory had finally been allowed to speak. The island that had been chosen because it could bring the war to Japan's doorstep had done exactly that. It had also become the place where a generation of young men had learned what it meant to win something at a price that could never be fully measured. The airfields hummed with activity. The bombers prepared for their missions. And the men who had made it all possible sat with the silence, carrying forward the quiet victory that had changed them forever. The news traveled across the ocean like a slow, unstoppable tide, and when it finally reached the halls of power in Tokyo, it arrived not as a single blow but as a series of shocks that would reshape everything that followed. In the weeks after the American forces secured the last ridges and the final organized resistance on Saipan fell silent, reports began to filter back to the Japanese capital through official channels and through the quieter, more troubling rumors that always traveled faster than any formal announcement. The island had been lost. The airfields that had been fought over so desperately were now in enemy hands. The long-range bombers that could take off from those captured runways would soon be able to reach Japanese cities directly, something that had seemed impossible only months earlier. For the leaders who had guided the empire through years of expansion and then through the grinding reality of a war that refused to end on favorable terms, this was more than a military setback. It was the moment when the conflict that had always been described as distant and winnable suddenly felt close enough to touch. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo carried the weight of that realization in ways that few outside his inner circle could fully see. He had risen through the ranks of the army and into political power on a platform of strength and certainty, the man who would deliver victory and protect the homeland at any cost. Now, in the quiet of his office or during the long nights when sleep would not come, he confronted the evidence that the homeland was no longer protected in the way he had promised. The loss of Saipan meant that the defensive perimeter he had helped construct was broken in a place that could not be easily repaired. It meant that the industrial heart of Japan, the cities where families lived and worked, would soon face attacks from the air that the military could no longer reliably prevent. Tojo had always believed in the spirit of the Japanese people and the determination of their soldiers. He still believed those things. But belief alone could not change the fact that the enemy now held the means to bring the war directly to Japanese soil in a way that had never happened before. In private moments, away from the formal meetings and the careful language of official reports, Tojo wrestled with the personal dimension of that failure. He had sons who might one day be called to fight in a war that was growing more dangerous with every passing month. He had colleagues and subordinates who looked to him for direction at a time when direction was becoming harder to define. He had spent years telling the Japanese people that sacrifice would bring triumph, that the hardships they endured were necessary steps on the path to a greater future. Now he faced the possibility that those sacrifices might not be enough, that the path they had all walked together was leading somewhere darker than anyone had wanted to imagine. The decision to resign was not made lightly. It came after long conversations with military and political advisors, after reviewing reports that left little room for optimism, and after confronting the reality that his continued leadership might no longer serve the nation in the way it once had. When he stepped down, it was with the knowledge that the shock of Saipan's loss had already begun to ripple outward, changing how the war was understood at every level of Japanese society. The political earthquake that followed Tojo's resignation was felt not only in the formal chambers of government but in the quieter spaces where ordinary people tried to make sense of what was happening. Families who had sons or husbands fighting on distant islands received the news through official channels or through the careful language of censored newspapers and radio broadcasts. The tone of those announcements was still resolute, still framed in terms of determination and the need for greater effort. Yet beneath the official language, a different current was beginning to flow. People spoke in lowered voices about what the loss of Saipan might mean. They wondered aloud whether the bombers would really come, and if they did, whether the defenses that had been promised would be enough. The quiet confidence that had sustained so many 3 years of hardship began to show small cracks, not open dissent, but the private doubts that people shared only with those they trusted most. In one Tokyo neighborhood, a mother whose son was serving in the Pacific sat with her husband after hearing the latest reports. They did not discuss politics or strategy. They spoke instead about the small things that had once felt ordinary, the garden they tended together, the letters that arrived irregularly from their son, the hope that he would come home when the fighting finally ended. The mother folded a recent letter carefully and placed it in a drawer where she kept the others, as if preserving the paper might somehow preserve the possibility that everything would still turn out as they had once believed it would. Her husband, a man who had worked in a factory producing war materials since the conflict began, sat in silence for a long time before speaking. He said only that the war had changed, that the distance they had always counted on was no longer there. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a realization that was spreading through homes and workplaces across the country. The homeland was no longer safely removed from the fighting. The doorstep that had once seemed so far away was now within reach of the enemy's bombers. The dawning understanding that Saipan's loss had brought the war closer to Japan itself arrived differently for different people. For some in positions of power, it came through maps and reports that showed the range of American bombers operating from the captured airfields. For ordinary citizens, it came through the gradual shift in tone from official sources, through the stories that traveled from person to person in markets and workplaces, and through the private calculations each family made about what the future might now require. The propaganda that had sustained morale for so long continued to emphasize resilience and the certainty of eventual victory. Yet the reality of what had happened on Saipan could not be entirely hidden, and the gap between what was officially said and what people quietly understood began to widen. That gap did not produce open resistance. It produced something quieter and perhaps more lasting, a slow erosion of the confidence that had once seemed unshakable. In the weeks and months after Tojo's resignation, the new leadership faced the difficult task of restoring a sense of direction while confronting the same strategic realities that had forced the change. The airfields on Saipan were not going to be retaken. The bombers that would soon operate from them could not be wished away. The only remaining choices involved how to respond to a threat that had moved from distant islands to the very edge of the home territory. Some advocated for even greater sacrifice and mobilization. Others began to consider, in private and in carefully guarded conversations, whether there might be other paths that did not lead to total destruction. These were not conversations that could be held openly. The culture of the time and the structure of the government made open debate about alternatives difficult and dangerous. Yet the questions existed, and they grew more pressing with every report of preparations on the captured airfields and every rumor of what those preparations might soon mean for Japanese cities. The human cost of this political and emotional shockwave extended beyond the leaders who resigned or the families who worried about sons at the front. It touched the daily lives of people who had already endured years of rationing, air raid drills, and the constant pressure of a war that demanded more with each passing season. In factories and neighborhoods, in schools and temples, the news of Saipan's fall arrived as one more reminder that the sacrifices already made might not be the last ones required. Some responded with renewed determination, finding strength in the same spirit that had carried them through earlier hardships. Others carried their fears more quietly, sharing them only in the most trusted circles or keeping them entirely to themselves. The small acts of resilience that had always sustained communities, the sharing of limited resources, the care for neighbors whose families were scattered by the war, the quiet maintenance of routines that gave life some semblance of normalcy, continued. They simply took place now against a backdrop of deeper uncertainty, a backdrop in which the homeland itself had become part of the battlefield in ways that had once seemed impossible. The educational weight of Saipan's loss and its ripple effects in Tokyo lived in the way a single island's capture forced a reckoning that went far beyond military calculations. The airfields that American forces had secured allowed bombers to operate within range of Japan in a sustained way that previous victories had not achieved. That strategic shift did not end the war immediately, but it changed the terms on which the war would be fought from that point forward. For Japanese leaders, it meant confronting the limits of what could be defended and the growing impossibility of protecting the home islands from direct attack. For ordinary citizens, it meant living with the knowledge that the conflict they had been told was being fought to protect them was now capable of reaching them in their own cities and homes. The shockwave that began with the loss of Saipan did not stop at the political level. It moved through every layer of Japanese society, changing how people understood their place in the war and what the future might still demand of them. In the quiet spaces where leaders and citizens alike tried to absorb what had happened, the personal dimension of that change was often the most difficult to bear. A general who had once spoken confidently about the defensive perimeter now reviewed reports with a different kind of attention, aware that the lines on his maps no longer represented the same kind of security. A factory worker who had given years to producing war materials wondered, in moments of private reflection, whether the effort would be enough when the enemy could strike from bases so much closer than before. A mother who had already lost one son in the fighting held her remaining children closer at night, not because she had given up hope but because the distance that had once protected them felt smaller and more fragile than it ever had. These private reckonings did not appear in official announcements or public speeches. They lived in the small, human moments that together formed the true landscape of a nation coming to terms with a war that had finally reached its own shores. These moments of political earthquake and personal reckoning in Tokyo, the hidden pressures on leaders, the quiet unraveling of confidence among ordinary people, and the deeper stories of how a distant island's loss reshaped an entire nation's understanding of the war, are the kind of essential chapters that often remain in shadow, away from the main headlines. If the human weight of this shockwave and the hidden stories behind Japan's shifting reality have stayed with you, and you want to explore more of these forgotten layers along with the secret operations and overlooked heroes that influenced the larger conflict, there is a free email newsletter that delivers an exclusive ebook called The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives into espionage, forgotten heroes, and the hidden stories behind the battles we think we already know. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The resignation of Tojo marked a visible turning point, but the deeper shift was already underway in the private thoughts and quiet conversations that no longer fit easily within the old framework of certain victory. The homeland that had been presented as safely distant from the fighting was now within reach of American bombers operating from captured airfields. The empire that had expanded across vast distances was now facing the possibility that the war would be decided not on distant islands but in the skies above its own cities. For the men and women who had carried the burden of that empire through years of conflict, this new reality demanded a different kind of courage, not only the courage to fight, but the courage to confront what fighting had cost and what it might still cost in the days ahead. The shockwave that began with Saipan did not end with Tojo's departure from power. It continued to move through the leadership and through the population, reshaping expectations, deepening fears, and forcing a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. The war had reached Japan's doorstep in a way that could no longer be denied, and the people who had once believed they were fighting to protect that doorstep were now living with the knowledge that protection alone might not be enough. The final phase of the conflict was beginning, and it would be fought with the memory of Saipan's loss already written into every calculation and every private fear. From the ashes of a single hard-won island rose a fire that would eventually consume an empire, carrying with it the stories of every man who fought there and every family touched by the cost. In the weeks and months after the last organized resistance on Saipan fell silent, the airfields that had been fought over so desperately began to hum with new activity. The runways that American engineers had patched and extended under fire now welcomed the long-range bombers that would carry the war directly into the heart of Japan. What had once been a distant dream discussed in planning rooms had become daily reality. The men who had survived the beaches, the nights of steel and shadow, the caves, the human wave, and the heartbreaking cliffs watched as the machines of a new phase of the war took shape around them. Some stayed to help build and protect those airfields. Others prepared to move on to the next campaign, carrying with them the invisible weight of everything they had already endured. The victory on Saipan had never been only about taking ground. It had always been about creating the platform from which the war could be brought to Japan's own cities in a sustained and devastating way. Now that platform was operational, and the fire that would rise from it was already being prepared. One young Marine who had landed on the first day and had somehow survived every phase of the fighting found himself assigned to security duty near one of the expanding airfields. He walked the perimeter in the quiet hours, watching the massive bombers arrive and depart, and found himself thinking about the men who had not lived to see this moment. He thought about the friend who had shared his last cigarette before the human wave, about the squad leader who had kept them moving through the caves when every instinct told them to stop, about the faces he had seen at the edge of the cliffs in those final terrible hours. He had written letters home during the battle, letters that tried to sound brave and finished. Now, in the relative quiet of the airfield perimeter, he found himself writing different kinds of letters, ones that tried to make sense of what winning had actually cost. He did not have the words yet. He was not sure he ever would. But the act of trying to put something on paper felt necessary, as if the stories of the men who had fallen needed to be carried forward somehow, even if only in fragments. On the other side of the ocean, in homes across Japan, families who had already been living with uncertainty received the news of Saipan's loss in ways that varied from household to household. Some heard it through official channels that still spoke of determination and greater effort. Others learned through the quiet conversations that traveled from neighbor to neighbor, conversations that carried the weight of what could no longer be hidden. A mother whose son had been fighting on the island sat with her husband after hearing the reports. They did not speak of strategy or of the larger war. They spoke instead of the small things, the way their son had always helped in the garden on his visits home, the letters that had grown shorter and more careful as the fighting intensified, the hope that had once felt certain and now felt fragile. The father, a man who had worked long hours in a factory producing war materials, sat in silence for a long time before saying that the distance they had always counted on was gone. The words were simple, but they carried the recognition that the war had changed in ways that would touch every family, not just those with sons at the front. The fire that rose from Saipan's ashes took many forms. The bombers that operated from the captured airfields began a campaign of strategic destruction that reached deeper into Japan than anything that had come before. Cities that had once felt safely removed from the fighting now faced nights of flame and destruction that would leave scars visible for generations. The men who flew those missions carried their own burdens, the knowledge that they were bringing the war to the enemy's homeland in the same way the enemy had once brought it to distant islands, the understanding that victory would require a level of destruction that no one had fully imagined when the conflict began. Some of them had brothers or friends who had fought on Saipan. They knew, in ways that went beyond official briefings, what that island had cost. They flew their missions with that knowledge, and they carried it home with them when the war finally ended. The true cost of Saipan could never be measured only in ground taken or airfields secured. It lived in the families who received the news that their sons or husbands would not be coming home. It lived in the men who survived but carried invisible wounds that would shape the rest of their lives. It lived in the quiet spaces where survivors sat with the memory of the cliffs and the caves and the human wave, trying to make peace with what they had seen and what they had been forced to do. A squad leader who had lost half his men in the northern push returned home years later and found himself unable to speak of the battle for a long time. When he finally did, it was not the dramatic stories that came out first. It was the small things, the way a wounded man had shared his last water with a comrade, the way another had kept joking even as the fighting grew worse, the way the silence after the final resistance ended had felt heavier than any noise. These were the details that had stayed with him, the human threads that connected the victory to the cost in ways no map or report could capture. The resilience that had carried men through the battle did not end when the fighting stopped. It appeared in the way survivors rebuilt their lives, in the way families who had lost everything found ways to care for one another, in the quiet determination of those who refused to let the war define them completely. A mother in a Japanese city that had been touched by the bombing campaign sat with her remaining children after the war ended and told them stories, not of glory or of defeat, but of the ordinary courage that had kept people going when everything seemed lost. She spoke of neighbors who shared what little they had, of strangers who offered comfort in the darkest moments, of the stubborn refusal to give up hope even when hope seemed foolish. These stories were not about the battle itself. They were about what came after, about the human spirit's capacity to endure and to find meaning even in the ashes of destruction. The educational truth that emerged from Saipan's legacy was both strategic and deeply human. The capture of the island had placed American air power within range of Japan in a way that previous victories had not achieved. The bombers that operated from those airfields carried out a campaign that weakened Japan's ability to continue the war and ultimately contributed to the decision to surrender. That strategic outcome had been the purpose behind the invasion from the beginning. Yet the path to that outcome had required sacrifices that no planner could have fully calculated, the lives lost on the beaches and in the caves, the families torn apart by the final choices at the cliffs, the men who returned home forever changed by what they had seen and done. The fire that rose from Saipan's ashes did not end the war by itself. It was part of a larger chain of events that included continued fighting on other islands, the firebombing of Japanese cities, and eventually the use of atomic weapons. Each step in that chain carried its own human cost, and each step was connected to the island that had made sustained bombing possible. In the quiet years after the war ended, survivors on both sides found themselves reflecting on what Saipan had meant in the larger story of their lives. An American veteran who had fought through the entire campaign sat with his grandchildren one evening and tried to explain why he still thought about the island decades later. He did not speak of strategy or of victory. He spoke of the men he had known, of the small acts of courage that had kept them going when everything seemed impossible, of the silence that had fallen over the island when the fighting finally stopped. He told them that remembering was not about glorifying war. It was about honoring the people who had been asked to give more than anyone should ever have to give, and about carrying forward the lesson that such sacrifices should never be asked for lightly. The grandchildren listened in the way children listen when they sense that what they are hearing matters more than they can yet understand. They would carry those stories forward in their own way, just as the veteran had carried the stories of the men who had not come home. The duty to remember that emerged from Saipan was not only about the battle itself. It was about the chain of events that began on those beaches and ended in the ashes of Japanese cities and the dawn of a new age. It was about the recognition that every strategic decision carries human consequences that ripple outward for generations. It was about the resilience of the human spirit that refuses to be broken even when the world seems determined to break it. And it was about the hope, fragile but persistent, that by remembering what was lost and what was gained, future generations might find ways to resolve conflicts without asking young men and women to pay the price that was paid on Saipan and in the fire that followed. These stories of courage and loss, of the long shadow cast by a single battle and the quiet resilience that persisted in its aftermath, deserve to be remembered not only in words but in the images and artifacts that bring the Pacific Theater and its human cost to life. If the personal journeys of the men who fought on Saipan and the families touched by its legacy have moved you, there are powerful ways to keep that connection alive. Authentic World War II memorabilia from the Pacific campaigns and the film Midway on Prime Video offer a chance to see and feel the stakes and the sacrifice in a way that honors everything these men and women endured. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The fire that rose from Saipan's ashes eventually consumed an empire, but it also left behind something that could not be destroyed. It left behind the stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when everything they knew was being stripped away. It left behind the memory of small kindnesses that persisted even in the darkest moments, the shared water, the quiet word of encouragement, the hand extended to a comrade who could not stand alone. It left behind the understanding that victory and defeat are never as simple as they appear on maps or in official reports, that every gain carries a cost that must be carried by someone, and that the true measure of any conflict is not the ground taken or the cities destroyed but the human lives forever altered by what was asked of them. The island that had been chosen because it could bring the war to Japan's doorstep had done exactly that. It had also become a place where the full weight of that bringing was revealed, in the beaches and the caves, in the human wave and the cliffs, and in the quiet victory that followed when the fighting finally ended. The men who had lived through it carried that weight forward. The families who had waited carried it as well. And the generations that came after inherited both the cost and the responsibility to remember, so that the fire that ended one empire might never again be asked to rise from the ashes of another.